What Queen Camilla inherited that Diana never got to wear. Part 1. A tiara. 15 years in the making and Diana never touched it. There is a photograph from 2007 that, if you know what you're looking at, tells you almost everything about how royal jewellery actually moves through a family. Not through drama, not through theft, but through something far colder and more mundane: timing. The image shows Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, arriving in Uganda for a state visit, wearing what is officially the largest diadem in the entire royal collection alongside its full matching parure. It's an extraordinary, almost overwhelming object, and Camilla would go on to wear it, and pieces from its set, again and again over the following 2 decades, becoming so associated with the look that most royal watchers now think of it as hers. What almost nobody mentions when they show that photo is the much stranger fact sitting underneath it. Diana, Princess of Wales, spent 15 years married into this family, attended state banquets on nearly every continent, and never once wore it. That's not a story about exclusion, it's a story about a clock that Diana simply ran out of. This particular tiara had belonged to Dame Margaret Greville, a formidable Edwardian society hostess and philanthropist who bequeathed a significant portion of her jewellery collection to her close friend Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, upon her death in 1942. Which means that throughout the entirety of Diana's marriage, from 1981 until her death in 1997, this tiara belonged not to the reigning queen and not to some general pool that Diana had a plausible claim on, but specifically and personally to the Queen Mother, a woman who lived to be 101 years old and who did not let go of her jewellery collection until the very end of that extraordinarily long life. It was only when the Queen Mother herself died in 2002, 5 years after Diana, that the piece finally passed to Elizabeth II. Diana was already gone. She simply wasn't alive long enough to inherit what her husband's grandmother was still, quite contentedly, holding on to. I find that detail almost unbearably poignant, honestly. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because it's a reminder that even something as apparently permanent and institutional as a royal jewellery collection is, underneath all the ceremony, just one very old woman's personal property, changing hands only when she finally lets go of it. We like to imagine the crown's jewels as belonging to the institution in some abstract sense, cycling neatly from queen to princess to duchess according to rank and title. The reality is messier and more human than that. Tiaras belong to people. People live as long as they live, and the women who happen to be alive and holding the keys when someone else dies get to keep whatever they were already wearing, for however many more decades fate allows them. Part 2. The woman who started it all. Dame Margaret Greville. Before we go any further into which tiaras did or didn't reach Diana, it's worth pausing on the extraordinary woman whose name attaches itself to so many of these pieces, because her story is almost stranger than the royal soap opera it eventually got tangled up in. Margaret Greville was not born into aristocracy at all. She was the daughter of a Scottish brewing magnate, William McEwen, and rumours have long persisted, never fully confirmed, that she may have actually been his illegitimate daughter rather than simply his ward. A detail that would have made her rise into the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian society even more remarkable. She married the Honourable Ronald Greville in 1891, and through a combination of enormous inherited wealth, a genuinely formidable social intelligence, and what appears to have been real personal warmth, she built herself into one of the most influential hostesses in Britain, entertaining prime ministers, foreign royalty, and eventually the British royal family itself at her country house, Polesden Lacey, in Surrey. What matters for our purposes is the friendship she formed with the young Duchess of York, the woman who would later become Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. A friendship close enough that Greville hosted part of the honeymoon of the future King George VI and his bride in 1923, and close enough that when Greville died childless in 1942, she left the Queen Mother the majority of her spectacular jewellery collection, along with a substantial cash legacy. It's worth sitting with how unusual this is. Most of what Camilla, and before her Elizabeth II, and before her the Queen Mother, wore under the Greville name did not originate as royal jewellery at all. It began as the personal collection of a wealthy commoner's daughter who happened to charm her way into becoming the confidant of a future queen. Every single piece with her name on it carries that slightly subversive origin story underneath the glamour. Jewellery bought with brewing money, left by choice rather than blood, to a family that had no legal claim to it whatsoever beyond genuine affection. This is, I think, one of the most overlooked truths in the entire Camilla versus Diana jewellery conversation. The pieces at the very centre of this controversy were never, in any legal or genealogical sense, family jewels belonging to the House of Windsor by right of birth. They were the personal property of an eccentric, wealthy, socially brilliant widow who chose out of friendship to give them to one specific woman. Everything that has happened to them since, who wore them, who didn't, who eventually inherited them, flows from that one act of personal generosity between two women in 1942, decades before Diana or Camilla had even entered the family. The story people want to tell is about entitlement and theft between two rival wives. The actual story starts with a childless widow deciding who she liked well enough to leave her diamonds to. Part 3. The piece the Queen kept for herself. If the Greville Diamond Tiara is a story about timing, the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland Tiara is a story about something closer to territory, and it's worth understanding just how different these two mechanisms actually are, because they get flattened together in most retellings. This particular tiara is arguably the most personally significant piece in the entire late Queen's collection. It was Queen Mary's emblematic wedding gift from a fund raised by the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland in 1893, which became the iconic jewel of her granddaughter, the oldest and longest reigning sovereign in British history, and it is now worn by Queen Camilla. Read that description again slowly. It became the iconic jewel of Elizabeth II. Not one of many tiaras rotating through her wardrobe. The iconic one, the piece she reached for again and again across 7 decades of public life, the one most closely associated with her own image as monarch, right down to its appearance on coinage and countless official portraits. And here is the detail that I think actually matters most in this whole story. For the entire span of Diana's marriage, this was not a tiara sitting quietly in a vault waiting to be lent out to a deserving relative. It was actively, constantly being worn by the reigning queen herself, week after week, decade after decade, on some of the most photographed occasions of the 20th century. There was simply no realistic version of events in which Elizabeth II was going to hand her own signature piece to her daughter-in-law to wear instead, any more than she would have handed over her own wedding ring. That isn't a snub aimed at Diana specifically. Princess Anne never wore it either, nor did Sarah Ferguson, nor did anyone else in that generation of royal wives, because it was simply spoken for in the most literal sense a piece of jewellery can be spoken for, by the woman wearing it on her own head in public for most of a century. Camilla only came to wear it once the position of the woman on the throne changed hands entirely, in the most direct kind of succession there is, the death of one monarch and the coronation of the next. Since King Charles III's coronation in 2023, Queen Camilla has worn Queen Elizabeth II's favourite Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara on several notable occasions, a choice that royal jewellery historians have specifically rated as Camilla paying homage to the beloved late Queen by selecting significant pieces for relevant occasions, rather than simply reaching for whatever looked impressive. There is something almost touching in that interpretation, whether or not you find it entirely persuasive. The idea that Camilla, stepping into a role she spent years being told the public would never accept her in, chose deliberately to signal continuity with the woman whose approval mattered most, rather than distancing herself from that legacy.
Part 4. The Tiara. Nobody was allowed to see. Then there's the piece that makes the entire premise of denied access collapse in the strangest possible way, because this tiara wasn't withheld from Diana specifically, it was withheld from everyone for half a century, including the two queens who technically owned it. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik Tiara, crafted by the French jeweler Boucheron around 1919, or, according to some jewelry historians, closer to 1921, features a striking design of brilliant and rose-cut diamonds pavé set in platinum, accented by 9 cabochon emeralds arranged in the traditional Russian kokoshnik silhouette, a rounded arch shape inspired by peasant headdresses that became fashionable across European high society in the wake of Russian imperial exiles fleeing the 1917 revolution. Like its diamond sibling, it came into the family collection through Mrs. Greville's 1942 bequest to the Queen Mother. When the Queen Mother passed away in 2002, her jewelry, including this kokoshnik, was inherited by Queen Elizabeth II. And then something almost eerie happened. Neither Queen Elizabeth ever wore the piece publicly, which led many jewelry historians and royal watchers to believe it was no longer part of the royal collection at all, perhaps sold off quietly or lost to time the way so many aristocratic jewels eventually are. It essentially vanished from public memory. The tiara had not been seen in public for over 50 years until Princess Eugenie wore it for her wedding in 2018, making it a truly memorable something borrowed that had in effect been sleeping in a vault since before most of the people watching her wedding were even born. One can only imagine the astonishment among genuine tiara historians, the small devoted community that tracks these pieces across decades, when this particular emerald kokoshnik suddenly reappeared on television screens after being presumed gone for 2 generations. Sit with that for a second, because it completely reframes the question this whole film is built around. Diana didn't miss out on this tiara because Camilla or the institution or anyone at all decided she wasn't worthy of it. She missed out on it because it was effectively invisible for the entire 50-plus years spanning the Queen Mother's later life, Diana's entire marriage, and most of Elizabeth II's own reign. 2 queens in a row apparently chose not to wear it for reasons nobody has ever fully explained. Perhaps sentimentality, perhaps simply changing fashion, perhaps nothing more complicated than a preference for other pieces in an enormous collection with far too many tiaras to wear them all. Nobody was allowed to see it. Not Diana, not the public, not really anyone. Camilla wearing it decades later in the 2020s isn't a case of one woman getting what another was denied. It's a case of one very old, very reticent piece of jewelry finally waking back up, long after the woman who might once have worn it in her prime had already died. Part 5. The Belgian Sapphires and a Suite. Named for a king, 2 more pieces round out this early pattern, and they follow the exact same logic once you look closely, even though their backstories couldn't be more different in tone. The Belgian sapphire tiara has a genuinely strange history. Originally the necklace of Princess Louise of Belgium, a woman whose own life reads like a cautionary tale of aristocratic scandal, having been effectively disgraced within her own family and eventually institutionalized amid disputes over debt and an affair that shocked even the notoriously permissive royal courts of her era. Her sapphire necklace, an heirloom of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha-Cohori, eventually made its way onto the market, where it was bought by the late Queen in the 1960s and reworked by the Crown Jewelers into a tiara. It has since become part of what jewelry historians call the George VI Victorian Suite, a themed grouping of diamond and sapphire pieces that Camilla chose specifically for her first home state banquet as Queen Consort, hosted at Windsor Castle in November 2022, just weeks after Elizabeth II's death. That choice of timing deserves its own moment of attention because I don't think it was accidental. Her very first major set-piece appearance as Queen Consort, at her very first state banquet under the new reign, and Camilla reached specifically for a sentimental parure with direct ties to the Queen's own father, King George VI. Not a flashy standalone piece designed to make a splash, but something with genealogical weight, something that said, in the visual language this family has always spoken fluently, "I understand what this collection means and I intend to honor it, rather than simply rate it." Whether or not you find that gesture convincing depends enormously on how much good faith you're willing to extend to a woman whose public image took the better part of 2 decades to rehabilitate. But the choice itself, laid out factually, tells a story of deliberate continuity rather than careless appropriation. Throughout Diana's marriage, this piece, once again, simply wasn't in circulation the way people assume royal jewelry always is. It was purchased by Elizabeth II herself, for herself, reworked to her own taste, and kept within her own personal rotation for the following 6 decades. A sapphire suite that belonged to the reigning monarch's private collection in the most literal sense, never intended as a loan piece for the wife of the heir apparent. Diana wore extraordinary sapphires during her lifetime, including her own famous engagement ring and a set gifted to her directly by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but this particular Belgian set was never hers to borrow, any more than the Queen's own wedding tiara would have been. It simply belonged, in every sense that matters, to Elizabeth II personally, for as long as Elizabeth II was alive to wear it. Part 6, the Aquamarines of Brazil and a gift addressed to one woman. Specifically, the aquamarine story follows an even purer version of this same pattern, because unlike almost every other piece in this collection, these particular stones were never inherited, bought, or repurposed from someone else's estate. They were given directly and specifically to Elizabeth II as a coronation gift from the people of Brazil in 1953. The Brazilian aquamarine tiara and parure were compiled by the late Queen over 3 subsequent decades, as additional aquamarine gifts and purchases were incorporated into an ever-expanding set, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable pale blue jewelry suites in the entire royal collection. A related but separate piece, the striking 5 aquamarine tiara, was seen only once on the Queen herself during a 1970 tour of Canada, before spending decades largely out of public rotation and eventually appearing on the Duchess of Edinburgh a few times in the past decade, and then on Queen Camilla in 2024. What makes this particular set so useful for understanding the actual mechanics of royal jewelry succession is how personally addressed it was from the very beginning. This wasn't a piece with murky provenance passed down through generations of aristocrats before landing in royal hands, and it wasn't a wedding gift given to commemorate a marriage in the way Diana's engagement ring or the Nizam of Hyderabad's necklace were. It was a gift given to Elizabeth II specifically as the new monarch to mark her own coronation, an object whose entire symbolic purpose was tied to her personally, not to the institution of the monarchy in the abstract, and certainly not to whichever woman happened to be married to the Prince of Wales at any given moment. Diana, for all the extraordinary jewelry she wore and was given during her marriage, was never going to be lent a set of stones that had been given by name to her mother-in-law as a personal coronation present. That would have been almost a category error, jewelry-wise, like lending out someone else's birthday gift. Camilla wearing pieces from this aquamarine collection today, then, isn't really comparable to the emotionally loaded question of whose jewelry is this, really? It's simply what eventually happens to any gift given to a long-lived person. Once she's gone, whoever occupies the role she held next tends to inherit not just her title, but the physical objects most closely associated with holding it. The aquamarines were never Diana's to be denied. They were Elizabeth II's, personally, from the moment they arrived in London in 1953, for exactly as long as Elizabeth II remained alive to enjoy them.
Part 7. The brooch that slept for a century. If you want a single object that captures just how strange and unpredictable royal jewellery succession can be, you could do worse than the Rothschild diamond watch brooch. a piece so obscure that most people, including many committed royal watchers, had genuinely forgotten it existed until Camilla wore it to Royal Ascot in June 2025. The 132-year-old diamond brooch had last been seen in public in 1936, a gap of 89 years. And its history stretches back to a wedding present given by Alice de Rothschild, known familiarly as Miss Alice, to Mary of Teck upon her marriage to the future King George V in 1893. The Queen Mother also wore the brooch back when her own title was still Duchess of York, in the years before her husband's unexpected accession to the throne following his brother's abdication. And then, for reasons that have never been publicly explained, Queen Elizabeth II never once wore it publicly during her 70-year reign. Read that timeline again, because it's genuinely remarkable. A brooch given as a wedding present in 1893, worn twice across the following 43 years by two different women, and then simply set aside, untouched in public for nearly 9 decades, through the entirety of the Second World War, the entirety of Elizabeth II's reign, the entirety of Diana's marriage and death, and the first years of Charles's own reign as king, until Camilla, apparently searching through the vault for something distinctive to wear to the races, rediscovered it and put it on. There is no scandal buried in this story. There is no villain. There is simply a piece of jewellery that an enormous, centuries-old collection had, in the most literal sense, misplaced emotionally if not physically, set aside by one queen for reasons of personal taste, never picked back up by the next, and waiting nearly a century for someone curious enough to bring it back into the light. This, more than almost any other single piece in Camilla's current collection, should put to rest the idea that royal jewellery moves through some deliberate, contested process of allocation, where every choice carries a message about who is favoured and who is snubbed. Sometimes a queen simply doesn't feel like wearing a particular brooch for 70 straight years, and it isn't a statement about anyone. It's a preference, indulged for an entire lifetime, in a collection so enormous that entire categories of extraordinary jewellery can vanish from public views for the better part of a century without anyone particularly noticing or minding. Part 8. The One Piece. Where the comparison actually bites. And yet, because this story would be far less interesting and considerably less honest if it were entirely a myth about misunderstood timing, there is exactly one piece where the comparison to Diana isn't a matter of unfortunate scheduling, and where the public reaction genuinely earned its outrage. It's a diamond and green enamel brooch with a very specific and very personal history. It was actually loaned to Princess Diana by the Queen, first owned by Queen Alexandra in 1863, and has remained within the royal family's jewels ever since. The piece features 3 white ostrich feathers rendered in diamonds, forming the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales. And it was the Queen Mother herself who passed it down to Diana specifically in 1981, precisely because of the title Diana held at that time. Diana wore it, unmistakably and repeatedly, as a necklace. She first dazzled the world with it at the Royal Opera House in 1982, and it became one of the recognisable pieces of her early public image as the new Princess of Wales. When Camilla, who now holds that same title by marriage to the same man, first as Princess of Wales in her own right and then as Queen, began appearing in the same brooch, first spotted at Cheltenham races in 2006, and again more prominently at a 2019 reception. Marking Charles's 50th anniversary as Prince of Wales, the reaction was immediate and unusually intense, even by the standards of a family whose every accessory choice gets dissected online. Royal fans were very much divided. Some called it plain tacky and absolutely appalling, suggesting the piece should have been passed on to Diana's sons, William and Harry, rather than to Camilla. Others rushed to Camilla's defence, arguing that the piece was part of the Crown estate, the royal collection, and not one of Diana's personal possessions, meaning the current Queen had every right in the world to wear it, and to wear it however she chose. I want to be honest about something here rather than simply pick the more satisfying side of the argument for the sake of drama, because I think both reactions contain a real piece of the truth, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Defenders were correct on a narrow technical point. This brooch was never Diana's personal property, and Camilla had every institutional right to wear it. But critics were also picking up on something genuinely real. The fact that this is the one object on this entire list that isn't a case of Camilla inherited what Diana never got to wear. It's the one case where Camilla is, quite literally, wearing the same physical object, tied to the same specific title that Diana once wore, in the same public role, doing the same symbolic job. The feelings that provokes are not irrational, and I don't think it's fair to wave them away simply because the underlying legal ownership was never in dispute. They're just feelings aimed at a piece of jewellery doing the one job jewellery in this family has always done, representing a title worn by whoever currently holds it, regardless of how uncomfortable that particular kind of continuity might feel to the people watching from home. Part 9. The jewellery Diana never could have worn, because it was never the crown's. So far, every piece we've discussed has come from the same general source, the enormous centuries-old royal collection that technically belongs to the institution of the monarchy, passed down according to whichever woman happens to be standing closest to the throne when its previous keeper dies. But there is an entire second category of jewellery in Camilla's current collection that makes the comparison to Diana even more strange to sustain, because it was never royal property at all, and never could have been lent to Diana under any circumstances, no matter how long she'd lived. This is Camilla's own personal family jewellery, inherited not through marriage into the House of Windsor, but through her own bloodline, decades before she ever met Prince Charles. The clearest example is the Cubit Shand Tiara, a delicate floral diamond piece that has nothing whatsoever to do with the crown jewels or the Greville bequest, or Queen Mary's wedding gifts. It takes its name from Camilla's own grandfather, Roland Cubit, who gifted the piece to her grandmother Rosalind, and from her father, Major Bruce Shand, a decorated Second World War cavalry officer who was twice awarded the Military Cross and twice taken prisoner by German forces, a genuinely remarkable wartime record that rarely gets mentioned in the endless jewellery coverage of his daughter. Camilla first wore this tiara on her own wedding day, not to Charles, but to her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, in 1973, more than 3 decades before she would ever become Duchess of Cornwall, at a point in her life when nobody watching that ceremony had any reason to think the family jewellery she wore that day would someday be discussed in the same breath as the crown jewels of England. There is something almost disorienting about that fact once you actually absorb it. The Cubit Shand Tiara predates Camilla's entire relationship with the royal family by over 30 years. It belonged to her own maternal line, purchased and gifted by her own grandfather to her own grandmother, entirely independent of anything the Windsors ever owned or controlled. Diana, for all the extraordinary access she had to the actual crown collection during her marriage, never had and never could have had any claim whatsoever on this particular tiara, because it simply isn't the monarchy's to lend. It belongs to the Shand family, full stop, and Camilla has since lent it onward within her own bloodline, to her daughter, Laura Lopes, for her own wedding, continuing a family tradition that has absolutely nothing to do with the institutional inheritance we've spent the last several sections dissecting. Part 10. Alice Keppel, King Edward's mistress, and the jewellery her great-granddaughter chases. If the Cubit Shand Tiara complicates the Camilla stole Diana's jewellery narrative by simply being unrelated family property, the next piece complicates it in a far stranger and more delicious way, because it involves an entirely different, much earlier royal scandal that has almost nothing to do with Diana at all. Camilla has a special fondness for certain pieces of jewellery that once belonged to her own great-great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, who was famously King Edward VII's mistress in the years leading up to his death in 1910. Alice Keppel was, by every historical account, an extraordinarily accomplished courtesan in the genuine old-fashioned sense of the word. Beautiful, socially brilliant, and remarkably successful at maintaining a decade-long relationship with the king that was tolerated and eventually even quietly embraced by Queen Alexandra herself, who reportedly permitted Keppel to visit the king's deathbed to say goodbye. Alice Keppel received a considerable amount of jewellery from Edward VII during their long affair, most of which was eventually inherited by her younger daughter Sonia, who later became Baroness Ashcombe. And Camilla's connection to this history is not incidental or symbolic, but direct and genealogical. Camilla is Alice Keppel's own great-great-granddaughter. King Charles, reportedly rather amused by the historical parallel between his wife's ancestor carrying on a long royal affair and his own decades-long relationship with Camilla before their eventual marriage, is said to have gone out of his way to track down and purchase pieces of Alice Keppel's original jewellery collection wherever he could find them on the market, specifically to give them to Camilla. One of her particular favourites from this reassembled collection is known as the Keppel Tiara, a piece with a direct emotional line running not through the House of Windsor's institutional vaults, but through Camilla's own family's remarkable, scandalous history with the British monarchy a full century before she herself entered it. I find this detail almost impossible to improve upon as a piece of historical irony, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it one of the strangest coincidences in modern royal history. Camilla's own great-great-grandmother was a royal mistress whose affair with the reigning king was an open secret tolerated by the queen of the day. 100 years later, Camilla herself became a royal mistress whose affair with the future king was for a period one of the most reviled open secrets in modern British public life, before eventually being not just tolerated but formalised through marriage and eventually coronation. King Charles buying back his wife's own ancestors' jewellery isn't an act of institutional inheritance at all. It's something closer to a wink, a deliberate, knowing nod to a family pattern repeating itself almost exactly a full century apart. And I suspect it says more about how Charles himself understands his marriage than almost any official statement the palace has ever released. Part 11. The ruby set worn once, and the horse. Named Minoru, Camilla's personal collection extends well beyond the cubit shand and Keppel pieces into a whole category of Edwardian-linked jewellery that jewellery historians have spent years painstakingly tracing, much of it connected not to any single dramatic scandal, but simply to the broader social world of Edward VII, Queen Alexandra, and the fashionable aristocratic circle around them known as the Marlborough House set. The same milieu that produced both Alice Keppel and generations later Margaret Greville herself. In March 2002, 3 years before her marriage to Charles, Camilla appeared at a Buckingham Palace dinner wearing an antique necklace and matching earrings, a piece later identified by the jewellery historian Geoffrey Munn in his landmark book on the history of tiaras, as a tiara of gold and platinum set with diamonds and synthetic rubies, designed so its top frame could be entirely removed, transforming it into a flexible necklace worn on its own. It remains to this day the only time she has worn this particular Edwardian ruby set in public, a single appearance, captured and catalogued, then apparently retired. Perhaps the most historically loaded of these Edwardian-connected pieces is the diamond Kokoshnik Tiara commissioned specifically as a gift to celebrate Edward and Alexandra's silver wedding anniversary in 1888, a piece Camilla has worn on several occasions, and one that connects directly back to the same royal generation that produced both her ancestors' love affair and the broader fashion for Russian-style Kokoshnik tiaras that would later produce the Greville Emerald piece we discussed earlier. And then there is perhaps the most charmingly odd item in her entire collection, the Minoru brooch, a horseshoe-shaped diamond bauble that spells out the name of a famous racehorse in diamond-set letters interspersed with rubies and sapphires, representing the colours of the royal family's own racing silks. Minoru belonged to King Edward VII himself, and in 1909, near the very end of his life, the king was reportedly delighted by the horse's victory at the Epsom Derby, a small, whimsical piece of jewellery commemorating not a marriage or a coronation, but a single afternoon at the races, more than a century before Camilla began wearing it to Ascot herself. There's something worth dwelling on in the sheer specificity of these pieces, because it reveals just how deep and genuinely personal Camilla's engagement with royal jewellery history actually runs, well beyond the handful of headline-grabbing tiaras that generate outrage online. A brooch commemorating a long-dead king's favourite racehorse, a ruby set worn exactly once and then quietly shelved, a Kokoshnik commissioned for a 19th century silver wedding anniversary. None of these objects have anything to do with Diana at all, and none of them were ever remotely available to her during her own marriage. Not because she was excluded, but because most of them simply weren't in active rotation, sitting instead in that same vast, half-forgotten vault that seems to swallow entire categories of extraordinary jewellery for decades at a stretch. Part 12. A turquoise suite, worn at the worst possible moment. Not every piece in Camilla's personal collection carries a story of quiet historical continuity, though. Some carry the scars of the single most difficult period of her public life, and it's worth pausing on one in particular, because it illustrates just how carefully Camilla and her advisors were navigating the jewellery question during the years when her relationship with the public was at its absolute lowest ebb. The turquoise demi-parure is an Edwardian-style set of sky-blue cabochon turquoise stones, each cradled in a halo of brilliant cut diamonds and linked by delicate leafy silver and gold flourishes, worn as a necklace with matching earrings. It is, by any objective measure, a genuinely beautiful set, evocative of a more romantic, softer era of jewellery design than the geometric bandeaus and severe diamond parures more commonly associated with the institutional crown collection. The timing of its most notable public appearance is what makes it worth discussing here. In the late 1990s, in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, Camilla was, by any honest historical account, among the most reviled women in Britain. A shadow figure blamed, fairly or not, for the collapse of a marriage the entire country had once celebrated as a fairy tale, and blamed again for standing in the way of the nation's collective grief over the loss of a princess many people felt they had genuinely loved. When Camilla appeared publicly at King Charles's 50th birthday celebration during this exact period of maximum public hostility, she did not reach for a royal tiara at all. She did not borrow anything from the crown collection, and she did not wear anything associated, even distantly, with Diana. Instead, she reached specifically into her own family heritage, the Shand family heirlooms, including pieces like the turquoise set, deliberately choosing jewellery with zero institutional weight and zero connection to the Windsor collection, at a moment when any misstep at all could have been catastrophic for her already fragile public standing. I think this choice deserves more credit than it usually gets in retellings of this period, because it runs directly counter to the Camilla helped herself to whatever she wanted narrative that dominates so much casual commentary. At the exact moment when Camilla had the least political capital, the least public goodwill, and arguably the most reason to want to project an image of grandeur and legitimacy by reaching for institutional jewels, she instead chose the opposite. Quiet, personal, unmistakably her own family's jewellery, worn at a private-turned-public event where the safest possible choice was to bring nothing borrowed at all. It's a small detail, easy to miss among the far louder controversies that would come later, but it tells you something real about how carefully this particular period of her public life was managed, and by whom. Part 13. A gold pendant. She almost never takes off. Not everything in this story is about tiaras and controversy and the weight of institutional history. Some of it is far smaller, and honestly, far more human. And it's worth including here precisely because it cuts against the grain of a documentary that has so far been almost entirely about grand diamonds and dead aristocrats. Camilla is known to be fond of a simple gold plate pendant necklace that she almost never takes off in her day-to-day life. Worn so consistently that royal watchers have specifically noted her wearing it throughout the mourning period immediately following Elizabeth II's death, though notably not for the funeral itself, where protocol presumably called for something more formal. At the centre of the pendant sits a small circular ruby, chosen deliberately because it happens to be Camilla's own birthstone, and the piece is understood within royal circles as a sentimental monogram necklace connected to her 5 grandchildren from her 2 children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes. There is nothing institutional about this piece at all, and nothing remotely connected to Diana, the Crown collection, or any of the grand historical narratives we've spent most of this film unpacking. It's simply a grandmother's favourite piece of jewellery, worn for entirely personal reasons that have nothing to do with royal succession or public image management.
I think it's worth including precisely because it's such a stark contrast to everything else in this story. A reminder that underneath the tiaras worth tens of millions of dollars and the century-old scandals involving Russian emperors and Edwardian mistresses, Camilla is also like anyone else, a woman who wears a small gold necklace because it reminds her of the people she loves most, in a family that happens to also own some of the most valuable gemstones on Earth. The Princess of Wales has her own version of this same instinct, having famously worn a personalized Duchess pendant necklace to mark the birth of Prince George, a small reminder that even inside an institution built on centuries of formal, symbolic jewelry, the women who marry into it still reach, in quieter private moments, for the same kind of sentimental, personal pieces that have nothing to do with any of that history at all. Part 14. 3 rings, 3 very different messages. Here's a detail that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it complicates the Camilla took everything narrative in a genuinely interesting and quite deliberate way, once you line up the choices side by side. When Charles proposed to Camilla in 2005, he did not present her with anything connected to Diana at all. He chose a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond flanked by 3 diamond baguettes on each side, a ring originally given to the Queen Mother by King George VI in 1929 to mark the birth of the Queen Mother's own daughter, the future Elizabeth II. The Queen Mother was photographed wearing it publicly as recently as the 1980s, and Charles apparently selected it specifically because of that deep sentimental connection to his beloved grandmother, rather than for any connection to the institutional crown collection or notably to anything that had ever belonged to Diana. Compare that choice to what happened 6 years later, when William proposed to Kate Middleton with his own mother's actual sapphire and diamond engagement ring, the exact piece Diana had worn from 1981 until her death, now permanently and unmistakably associated with her in the public imagination, deliberately reintroduced by her son as an explicit act of remembrance. And then compare both of those choices to Diana's own engagement ring in 1981, a piece she was reportedly permitted to select herself from a jeweler's catalog, a striking blue sapphire surrounded by 14 diamonds that was, at the time, considered refreshingly modern and personal, precisely because it hadn't been inherited from anyone at all. 3 rings. 3 completely different philosophies about what an engagement ring in this family is supposed to mean. Diana chose something new and personal to signal a break from stuffy tradition. William chose something old and specifically his mother's to signal continuity with a woman he'd lost too young. And Charles chose something old but deliberately unconnected to Diana, threading a needle between honoring family history and avoiding what would have been an almost unbearably tone-deaf symbolic collision. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Charles's choice here was the most careful, most quietly diplomatic decision in this entire story, and it rarely gets credited as such. He had, in theory, direct access to pieces that had once belonged to his first wife, pieces that, as we'll discuss shortly, were split between his sons rather than returned to any central vault. He chose none of them. He reached instead for his grandmother's ring, a piece with genuine sentimental weight to him personally, but with zero connection whatsoever to the marriage he was leaving behind in order to finally marry the woman he'd loved for decades. Whatever else you think about how Charles handled the entire Diana chapter of his life, this particular choice suggests someone who understood, with real precision, exactly which symbolic lines could not be crossed. Part 15, A Quiet Wedding and the Jewelry Question. Nobody wanted to answer the wedding itself, held as a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall on the 9th of April 2005, was deliberately modest by royal standards, a reflection of the genuinely complicated position the couple found themselves in, marrying not as a fresh young prince and his bride, but as two middle-aged people whose relationship had caused real, lasting pain to a woman the public had adored and then mourned. In the years leading up to that day, several royal commentators had speculated that Camilla would take the title of Princess Consort rather than the full weight of Princess of Wales, precisely to avoid the appearance of stepping directly into Diana's old role, title and all. That speculation turned out to be more complicated than expected, and the eventual reality that Camilla would indeed hold the title of Princess of Wales throughout Charles's time as heir, simply choosing not to use it publicly out of evident sensitivity to how it would be received before becoming Queen Consort and then Queen upon his accession, reflects just how carefully every single title and every single piece of jewelry in this entire story has had to be managed for public consumption. What's notable, looking back at that period now with the benefit of 2 more decades of hindsight, is how conservative Camilla's early jewelry choices actually were. Several royal experts, in the run-up to the 2005 wedding, predicted she would choose understated pieces, wary of provoking exactly the kind of comparison to Diana that has fueled online arguments ever since. And by most accounts, that prediction held true for the earliest years of her marriage. It would take until 2007, with that first major state visit to Uganda, for Camilla to begin wearing the truly grand institutional pieces like the Greville parure in earnest. And it would take until Elizabeth II's death in 2022, 17 years after her wedding, for Camilla to begin wearing the Queen's own most personally significant tiaras at all. This was not a woman who arrived and immediately began working her way through the vault. It was a slow, cautious, multi-decade progression, calibrated at every stage against a public mood that took an extraordinarily long time to soften. Part 16. What Diana actually wore and what actually happened to it. To understand what Camilla did and didn't inherit, it helps enormously to understand, in real factual detail rather than tabloid shorthand, what happened to Diana's own jewelry after her death in 1997, because the popular assumption that it all simply funneled straight into some central vault Camilla later raided is, quite simply, not what happened. Many pieces of Diana's jewelry were, as we've discussed, part of the royal collection all along, technically on loan to her during her marriage and title as Princess of Wales, meaning they returned to that same institutional pool upon her death, exactly as they would have for any princess before or since. But a great deal of what Diana wore, particularly in the post-divorce years between 1996 and 1997, was her own genuinely personal property. Gifts from friends, pieces purchased in her own name, items given to her directly rather than lent by the crown, and these pieces followed an entirely different path. Her sons, William and Harry, picked out specific pieces from their mother's personal jewelry collection to keep as heirlooms, rather than inheriting the entire collection wholesale or seeing it distributed by some formal institutional process. Diana's iconic sapphire engagement ring went to William, who would go on to use it himself 17 years later to propose to Kate Middleton. He also received a pair of his mother's pearl earrings, which Kate has since worn on several occasions, including during the VE Day 75th anniversary celebrations in May 2025. Harry, for his part, inherited a gold Cartier watch, later worn by Meghan Markle, along with Diana's aquamarine cocktail ring, a piece featuring a large aquamarine stone set with small diamonds and 24-karat yellow gold, which Diana had received in 1996, after her divorce, as a gift from a close friend. Meghan wore that same ring during her own wedding reception in 2018. Harry also inherited a pair of Diana's gold butterfly earrings, which Diana had worn during a tour of Canada in 1986, and which Meghan first wore publicly during a tour of Australia in 2018. Notice what's actually happening in this entire distribution, because it matters enormously for the question this whole documentary is built around. None of this personal property ever passed through Camilla's hands at any point. It went directly from Diana's estate to her two sons, and from her sons to their own wives, in an entirely separate lineage that has nothing whatsoever to do with the institutional crown collection Camilla inherited as queen consort. The genuinely personal, sentimental, post-divorce jewelry that Diana wore as herself, rather than as a working member of the royal family, belongs today to Kate and Meghan, not to Camilla, and by every credible account it has stayed that way without exception. The pieces Diana wore that Camilla does now wear are, almost without fail, pieces that were never Diana's personal property to begin with, technical loans from an institutional collection that Diana herself understood. Throughout her marriage, she did not actually own. Part 17. The Coronation and a Deliberate Avoidance. When King Charles III was crowned in May 2023, the jewelry choices made for that single ceremony were scrutinized more intensely than almost any other event in this entire story, precisely because a coronation is the one moment when royal jewelry stops being a matter of personal taste and becomes an explicit, formal statement about the nature of the monarchy itself. One of the most closely watched questions in the months leading up to the ceremony was whether Camilla would be crowned using Queen Mary's crown, which famously houses the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a stone whose acquisition by the British Crown in the 19th century remains one of the most bitterly contested provenance disputes in the entire history of colonial-era jewelry, claimed by India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran alike, each with their own historical argument for rightful ownership. Buckingham Palace ultimately confirmed that Camilla would be crowned using Queen Mary's crown, but with its setting reworked to remove the Koh-i-Noor entirely, replacing it instead with diamonds from Elizabeth II's own personal jewelry collection, including stones from the Cullinan diamond. This was, by any measure, a deliberate and quite carefully calculated diplomatic decision made at the very highest levels of palace planning, designed specifically to avoid reigniting a geopolitical controversy that had flared up repeatedly every time the stone appeared in public over the preceding decades. It's worth noting that this decision had nothing whatsoever to do with Diana, and everything to do with contemporary international relations, a reminder that the jewelry choices being made around Camilla today are shaped as much by 21st century diplomatic sensitivity as by any lingering family tension from the 1990s. The choice to reuse Queen Mary's crown itself, rather than commissioning something entirely new, was itself a meaningful statement, echoing the same pattern of deliberate continuity we've seen throughout Camilla's other jewelry choices as queen. Rather than debut a brand new coronation crown built specifically for her, in the way some royal consorts historically have, Camilla chose to physically reuse and rework an existing royal object, adapting it rather than replacing it, a small but telling detail in an era when the monarchy has been under sustained public pressure to demonstrate restraint, continuity, and a certain kind of practical modesty, particularly regarding contested colonial-era gemstones. Part 18. The State Banquets of 2023 through 2025. Beyond the coronation itself, the pattern of Camilla's jewelry choices across the state banquets of the following years reveals a consistent, almost methodical approach to which pieces get deployed for which occasions, and it's worth walking through several of these in sequence, because the through line becomes much clearer once you see the choices laid end-to-end, rather than as isolated headlines. At the Windsor Castle State Banquet held for the 2025 U.S. state visit, Camilla appeared in a diamond and sapphire tiara paired with diamond earrings and the diamond Greville festoon necklace, a combination that jewelry historians noted specifically for how it balanced the grandeur expected of a banquet honoring an American president with pieces drawn from the same Greville legacy that has become, in effect, her signature. Earlier that same year, for the first state visit made by France in 17 years, Camilla wore what jewelry historians described as an exceptional parure of diamonds and sapphires, a deliberate echo of the earlier Belgian sapphire and George VI Victorian suite choices, suggesting a conscious strategy of returning to specific, well-documented sets for major diplomatic occasions rather than debuting something unfamiliar each time. This is, in its own quiet way, a genuinely interesting piece of evidence against the Camilla is simply grabbing whatever she likes narrative. State banquet jewelry, at this level, tends to be selected with real deliberation, often weeks in advance, coordinated between the Queen's dressers and the broader diplomatic planning around each visit, precisely because the visual message sent by a specific tiara or necklace genuinely does register with the visiting head of state and their own advisors, whether or not the average television viewer picks up on the nuance.
For the Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey in March 2024, Camilla chose a spectacular diamond and aquamarine brooch that had also belonged to Queen Alexandra, extending the Edwardian thread that runs through so much of her personal jewellery philosophy, even into her most formal institutional appearances. And for the Betfair Ascot Chase Race Day in February 2025, in a considerably more relaxed and personal setting, she opted for her favourite diamond and pearl drop earrings, her blue agate Alhambra bracelet from Van Cleef and Arpels, a contemporary luxury piece with no royal history at all, simply a beautiful modern object she happens to enjoy wearing, and the whimsical Minoru brooch we discussed earlier, connecting the day's racing theme back to Edward VII's own beloved champion horse from over a century before. Part 19. $120 million, locked beneath a palace. It's worth stepping back at this point to actually grapple with the scale of what we've been discussing throughout this entire film, because the individual stories of specific brooches and tiaras can obscure just how genuinely enormous this collection is as a whole. When Camilla became Queen Consort in September 2022, she inherited what is widely described as the largest privately held jewellery collection in the world, often estimated to be worth somewhere in the region of $120 million, or roughly £100 million, a figure that itself likely understates the true value, given how difficult it is to properly appraise pieces with this kind of irreplaceable historical significance, pieces that would be effectively priceless at any legitimate auction house, even before accounting for their raw material worth. This collection didn't simply appear with Elizabeth II. It represents the accumulated inheritance, purchases and gifts of roughly 400 years of British royal history, expanding and contracting with each generation as pieces were sold off during difficult periods, commissioned anew during prosperous ones, gifted by foreign dignitaries during diplomatic visits, and bequeathed by wealthy friends like Margaret Greville, who had no royal blood at all, but plenty of both money and affection to spare. The collection includes, by conservative estimate, several dozen tiaras alone, alongside hundreds of individual necklaces, brooches, earrings and rings, the vast majority of which never appear in public at all, sitting instead in storage that has been described as an underground converted air raid shelter beneath Buckingham Palace, fitted with an alarm system that connects directly to the palace's own on-site police station. Understanding this scale changes the entire emotional register of the Camilla versus Diana jewellery conversation, I think, in a way that's worth sitting with honestly. We are not talking about a small, finite pool of family heirlooms, where every choice necessarily comes at someone else's expense. We are talking about a collection so vast that entire tiaras can go unworn for 50 or even 90 consecutive years without anyone particularly noticing, let alone objecting. In a collection of that size, the question of whether any single woman deserved any single piece starts to feel almost beside the point. There was, quite simply, more than enough jewellery in that vault to have outfitted several entirely separate royal families for several entirely separate lifetimes, with plenty left over that nobody has worn publicly in living memory at all. Part 20. The pattern, named plainly, having walked through nearly every major piece in Camilla's current collection, the Greville diamonds, the Girls of Great Britain tiara, the Emerald Kokoshnik, the Belgian sapphires, the Brazilian and 5 aquamarine sets, the Rothschild brooch, the one genuine overlap with Diana's own wardrobe, and then the entirely separate universe of Camilla's own family jewellery connected to the Cubits, the Shands, and Alice Keppel. I think it's worth naming the pattern explicitly, plainly, without the hedging that tends to creep into royal coverage, designed to avoid offending anyone. Almost everything Camilla wears today that once belonged to the institutional Crown collection falls into one of three categories. Pieces that were never available during Diana's lifetime because the reigning queen or queen mother was still actively wearing them personally. Pieces that were technically owned by the family but had fallen out of public circulation for decades before Diana ever arrived, sometimes for reasons nobody has ever explained, or pieces that arrived as gifts specifically and personally addressed to Elizabeth II herself, never intended for general circulation among royal wives at all. The genuine exceptions to this pattern, pieces where Camilla is unambiguously wearing something with a direct, symbolically loaded connection to Diana specifically, are remarkably rare, really amounting to a single, well-documented brooch tied to the Prince of Wales title itself. A piece whose reappearance on Camilla genuinely does carry a different emotional weight than everything else on this list, precisely because it represents the one place where the comparison between these two women isn't a matter of unfortunate timing, but of direct, deliberate continuity in a specific role. Everything else, the vast majority of what generates outraged headlines and viral social media posts, turns out, on close historical inspection, to be considerably less dramatic than it's usually made to sound. Not villainy, not entitlement, not one woman helping herself to another's rightful inheritance, but the ordinary, somewhat cold mechanics of an institution that simply keeps functioning long after any single person involved in its dramas has died. Part 21. A much older pattern than anyone involved today. None of this succession drama, it's worth saying clearly, is unique to Camilla, or to Diana, or even to this particular century. The exact same mechanism, jewellery belonging personally to whichever woman happens to occupy the very top of the family at any given moment, rather than circulating freely among every royal wife simultaneously, governed every single generation that came before this one, often with far less public scrutiny, simply because there were no tabloids or social media accounts dedicated to cataloguing every brooch. Queen Victoria, during her own extraordinarily long reign, kept an enormous personal collection almost entirely to herself for decades, particularly during the long period of mourning following Prince Albert's death, when she withdrew from public jewellery wearing almost entirely, leaving her daughters-in-law, including the future Queen Alexandra, to develop their own separate collections, rather than simply borrowing from a grieving monarch who had, in a sense, checked out of public glamour altogether. Queen Alexandra herself, once she finally became Queen Consort upon Victoria's death in 1901, spent the following decade collecting and commissioning an extraordinary array of jewellery, much of it in the Kokoshnik style that would later echo through the Greville pieces we've discussed. Jewellery that then passed, upon her own death in 1925, not automatically to whichever woman happened to be the next Princess of Wales, but according to her own personal wishes, distributed among specific family members she chose. Queen Mary, arguably the most dedicated and knowledgeable jewellery collector in the entire history of the House of Windsor, spent decades deliberately reassembling pieces that had been sold off or scattered by previous generations, buying back family jewels at auction whenever she could, commissioning new pieces like the Lover's Knot Tiara to replicate treasured designs from her own grandmother's collection, and ultimately building the single largest and most historically significant personal jewellery collection any royal consort has ever assembled. A collection she then, upon her own death in 1953, left according to her own specific will, rather than any automatic institutional formula. The pattern, in other words, has always been the same. Whoever sits at the top personally controls an enormous, ever-growing collection, wears from it according to her own taste for as long as she lives, and only upon her death does that collection move to whoever inherits her position. At which point the entire cycle begins again with a new set of personal preferences, a new set of occasions to dress for, and an entirely new set of pieces that will, in turn, sit untouched and half forgotten until the next transition. Diana entered this pattern partway through, during Elizabeth II's own decades-long personal custodianship of the collection, and left it, through death, before that custodianship ever changed hands. Camilla entered the same pattern decades later, and happened to still be present when the custodianship finally did change hands. Neither woman broke this pattern, or bent it to her advantage. Both were simply subject to it, at different points along a cycle that has been running, largely unchanged for the better part of 2 centuries. Part 22. What the Russian Revolution actually left behind. We touched earlier on the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik's connection to the aesthetic aftermath of the Russian Revolution, but the broader story of how Romanov-era jewellery ended up scattered across British aristocratic and royal collections deserves its own moment of context, because it explains so much of the deeper texture running underneath this entire film. When the Russian imperial family was overthrown in 1917 and executed the following year, an enormous quantity of jewellery belonging to the extended Romanov family and the broader Russian aristocracy found its way out of the country through a chaotic combination of smuggling, sale, and outright theft, flooding into European markets throughout the 1920s, at a moment when many of the aristocrats who had once owned these pieces were suddenly destitute refugees, desperate for whatever cash a London or Paris jeweller was willing to offer for stones with no paperwork and increasingly uncomfortable questions attached to their origin. British and European aristocratic buyers absorbed a remarkable amount of this material during exactly this period, often with only the vaguest understanding of precisely which Russian noblewoman had worn a given piece, or under what circumstances she had lost it. Queen Mary herself was a notably enthusiastic buyer during this era, acquiring several pieces with Russian imperial connections, including jewellery once belonging to the Grand Duchess Vladimir, whose own iconic tiara was, according to family legend, smuggled out of revolutionary Russia, hidden inside ordinary luggage by a loyal British diplomat, before eventually being sold to Queen Mary by the Grand Duchess's own daughter and reworked to be worn alongside a set of emeralds already in the British royal collection. This context matters enormously for understanding why pieces like the Emerald Kokoshnik carried the kind of sensitive origin concerns that, as we discussed in an earlier chapter about Meghan Markle's own wedding jewellery choices, made certain tiaras politically fraught for anyone marrying into this family, regardless of who they were or when they arrived. It's not simply that these pieces are old or valuable or historically significant in the ordinary sense. Many of them carry the specific, unresolved weight of a genuine human tragedy, a family murdered, an aristocracy destroyed, jewellery sold off in desperation by people who had lost everything else. A weight that no amount of institutional polish ever quite manages to erase, and one that any woman wearing these pieces, whether Diana, Camilla, Meghan, or Kate, inevitably carries into the room with her, whether she intends to or not. Part 23. The woman who made it all possible. It's worth returning, before we move any further, to Margaret Greville herself, because her own life story deserves more than the passing mention it usually gets in jewellery coverage, and because understanding her fully changes how you read every single piece with her name attached. Polesden Lacey, her country estate in Surrey, became during the interwar years one of the genuine centres of British social and political life, hosting not just royalty but prime ministers, foreign statesmen, and the full spectrum of London's most influential figures, all drawn by Greville's reputation as a witty, generous, and occasionally quite sharp-tongued hostess who understood exactly how to make herself indispensable to the people who mattered most. She was, by multiple historical accounts, capable of genuine cruelty in her social judgments and gossip, and her politics, like those of a great many wealthy Britons of her era, included views on certain subjects that read as deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. She was, in other words, a complicated, flawed, entirely human figure, not a simple fairy godmother handing out diamonds out of pure generosity. but her genuine friendship with the Queen Mother, sustained across decades and cemented through countless visits, letters and shared confidences, was apparently real enough that when she died childless in 1942, having outlived her husband by over 2 decades, she chose to leave the bulk of her extraordinary jewellery collection, assembled with her own considerable brewing fortune, purchased from the finest jewellers of her era, including Boucheron and Cartier, not to any distant relative, but to the one woman she had come to consider genuinely close family in every sense but blood. I think it's worth sitting with the fact that this entire chapter of royal jewellery history, the chapter that produced both the largest tiara in the collection and the emerald piece that slept for 50 years, exists at all only because one wealthy, childless, socially ambitious woman happened to form a real friendship with a young duchess in the years before the duchess unexpectedly became queen. Remove that friendship and none of the Greville jewellery ever enters the royal collection at all. There is no institutional inevitability here, no ancient bloodline claims stretching back centuries. There is simply one woman's choice made out of genuine personal affection that happened to reshape what an entire family would be wearing a full century later. Parts 24. Diana's own wedding tiara and a parallel nobody draws. Here's a comparison that almost never gets made, and I think it should be, because it illustrates something genuinely important about how differently these two women's relationships to jewellery actually began. When Diana married Charles in 1981, she did not wear a piece from the Crown collection for her wedding ceremony itself. She wore the Spencer tiara, a delicate diamond piece belonging entirely to her own family, the Spencers, rather than to the Windsors. A tiara that had been worn by her own sisters at their weddings before her, and one that, crucially, remains Spencer family property to this day, entirely outside the reach of any institutional royal inheritance, exactly the way the Cubit Shand tiara remains Shand family property, regardless of anything Camilla has since inherited through marriage. This parallel matters because it undercuts a certain lazy assumption that tends to creep into popular retellings of this story. The idea that Diana arrived into this family with nothing of her own, entirely dependent on whatever the institution chose to lend her, while Camilla arrived decades later already sitting on a pile of ill-gotten personal treasure. The reality is that both women brought their own family jewellery into this story, and both women's own family jewellery has remained, in each case, entirely separate from the institutional Crown collection ever since. Diana's sisters and their descendants retain rights to the Spencer tiara, regardless of anything that happened between Diana, Charles and Camilla. Camilla's own daughter has worn the Cubit Shand tiara at her own wedding, entirely independent of anything Camilla later inherited as queen. These two threads run in parallel throughout this entire story, rarely intersecting, and yet the popular narrative almost always focuses exclusively on the institutional Crown collection thread, as though it were the only jewellery either woman has ever owned or worn. Part 25. The young princess and her evolving relationship with diamonds. It's worth spending a moment on how Diana's own relationship with jewellery actually evolved across her public life, because it wasn't static, and understanding its evolution helps explain why her legacy feels so much more personal and immediate than the largely institutional story we've spent most of this film discussing. In the earliest years of her marriage, throughout the first half of the 1980s, Diana's jewellery choices were, by most accounts, still finding their footing. She wore pieces lent to her by the Queen and the Queen Mother for major state occasions, including the Lover's Knot tiara that would eventually become so associated with her image, while gradually building her own, more personal collection through gifts from Charles, from foreign dignitaries during official tours, and from her own increasingly confident sense of personal style. By the middle of the decade, during tours through Australia, Canada, and elsewhere in the Commonwealth, Diana had developed a genuinely distinctive public jewellery identity, mixing grand institutional pieces for formal state banquets, with much simpler, more approachable jewellery for public walkabouts and hospital visits. a deliberate contrast that mirrored her broader, carefully cultivated image as a member of the royal family who remained relatable to ordinary people in a way her husband's own family had, by that point, largely stopped managing to project. The gold butterfly earrings she wore during her 1986 Canadian tour, simple and unpretentious compared to the grand diamond parures of formal banquets, exemplify this deliberate range perfectly, and it's precisely because of this careful, considered approach that her jewellery choices from this era still resonate so strongly decades later, replicated and referenced by her daughters-in-law long after her death.
Part 26. Freedom, Divorce, and a New Kind of Jewelry Box. The jewelry Diana wore in the final years of her life, following her formal divorce from Charles in 1996, tells a somewhat different and, in its own way, more poignant story. Freed from many of the institutional obligations that had governed her jewelry choices during her marriage, Diana began wearing pieces that were entirely her own, gifts from close friends rather than loans from the crown, purchased with her own money rather than selected from a palace vault, chosen according to her own taste rather than any diplomatic calculation about which country's dignitaries she'd be meeting that evening. The aquamarine ring Harry would later inherit, gifted to her by a friend in 1996, exemplifies exactly this shift, jewelry as a genuinely personal expression of a newly independent woman, rather than as a symbolic extension of an institutional role she had spent 15 years fulfilling. This is, I think, part of why the jewelry Diana wore during this final brief period of genuine personal freedom carries such a specific emotional charge for people who remember her, and why watching her sons carefully preserve and eventually gift these specific pieces to their own wives feels so different from the broader institutional inheritance question this documentary has otherwise focused on. These weren't tiaras representing centuries of dynastic continuity. They were a woman's own jewelry box, assembled during the only period of her adult public life when she got to choose entirely for herself, without a palace dresser, a Foreign Office briefing, or 7 decades of institutional precedent standing over her shoulder. That her sons chose to keep these specific, deeply personal pieces rather than any of the grander institutional jewelry she'd worn during her marriage tells you something about what they understood their mother's real legacy to actually be. Part 27. A war hero's daughter and a family. Nobody expected to matter. Turning back to Camilla herself, it's worth understanding where she actually came from, because her own family background gets flattened in most popular coverage into little more than the woman who came between Charles and Diana, when in fact her lineage is genuinely interesting in its own right and directly explains several of the personal jewelry threads we've already discussed. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, was a decorated Second World War cavalry officer, twice awarded the Military Cross for gallantry and twice taken prisoner by German forces during the North African and Italian campaigns, a genuinely remarkable, dangerous, and repeatedly heroic wartime record that predates his daughter's fame by half a century and rarely gets mentioned at all in the endless coverage of her jewelry and scandals. Her mother, Rosalind Cubitt, came from the Cubitt family, prominent property developers responsible for building large portions of what are today some of London's most desirable neighborhoods, a fortune substantial enough to have funded, among other things, the Cubitt Shand tiara itself, gifted by Rosalind's own father to mark her marriage. Camilla, born Camilla Rosemary Shand in 1947, grew up in genuinely comfortable upper-middle-class English country society, not aristocracy in the strictest sense, but close enough to it and wealthy enough that her family's own jewelry collection, modest by royal standards but genuinely significant by ordinary ones, was already well established decades before she ever crossed paths with the Prince of Wales. Part 28. A complicated first marriage and a long road back. Camilla's own first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973 followed a path that has since become one of the most extensively documented and dissected relationships in modern British royal history, precisely because of its long, complicated overlap with Charles's own life. Camilla and Charles had known each other since the early 1970s, reportedly through mutual friends in London society, and their relationship, on and off, continued in various forms throughout both of their subsequent marriages, hers to Andrew Parker Bowles, his to Diana, a fact that became devastatingly public in the early 1990s through a series of leaked private phone conversations, an episode that dominated British tabloid coverage for years and caused genuine, lasting damage to how the public perceived both Charles and Camilla, damage that would take the better part of 2 decades to even partially repair. Diana herself referenced this relationship directly and famously in her own 1995 television interview, describing a marriage that had, by her own account, involved 3 people rather than 2, a line that instantly became one of the most quoted phrases in modern royal history, and one that cemented Camilla's public image for years afterward as the woman responsible for the collapse of what much of the country had once genuinely believed was a fairy tale marriage. Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles eventually divorced in 1995, the same year Charles and Diana's own marriage formally ended, and Camilla spent the following years largely out of public view, absorbing a level of tabloid hostility that, by most contemporary accounts, was genuinely brutal, sustained, and at times viciously personal. Precisely the period during which, as we discussed earlier, she deliberately chose to wear her own quiet family jewelry rather than anything connected to the institution she had not yet formally joined. It would take Diana's death in 1997 and the several years of careful, gradual public reintroduction that followed before Camilla's relationship with Charles could even be publicly acknowledged again, let alone formalized through marriage in 2005. This slow, deliberately cautious rehabilitation forms the essential backdrop against which every single jewelry choice discussed in this documentary has to be understood, because a woman who spent the better part of a decade being described in the British press in some of the most hostile terms ever directed at a public figure was never, at any point in the following 2 decades, going to casually reach for a piece of jewelry with even the faintest connection to the woman. The public still, in many cases, considered the injured party in this entire story. Part 29, the slowest public relations campaign in modern royal history. The years between Diana's death in 1997 and Camilla and Charles's eventual marriage in 2005 amount to what royal historians and media analysts have since come to regard as one of the most patient, methodical image rehabilitation campaigns in modern British public life. A process so gradual that it's genuinely difficult to point to any single moment where public opinion decisively shifted, precisely because that was the entire strategy. Rather than attempt any dramatic reintroduction, Charles's advisors reportedly favored a slow drip of carefully managed public appearances, beginning with small, low-key joint outings that tested public reaction in relatively controlled circumstances, gradually building toward larger, more official engagements only once each preceding step had been absorbed without significant backlash. This period saw Camilla almost entirely absent from any jewelry with institutional weight, appearing instead in her own personal pieces or in nothing particularly notable at all. A jewelry silence, if you want to think of it that way, that mirrored the broader silence around her formal role in Charles's life during these same years. It's worth noting that this approach worked eventually in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginable to anyone following the coverage in 1997, when polling regularly showed public opinion of Camilla at levels of hostility rarely seen for any non-criminal public figure in British life. By the time the couple's engagement was formally announced in 2005, public reaction, while still mixed, had softened enough that the wedding itself proceeded with considerably less controversy than might once have seemed possible, a testament to just how effective sustained, careful, low-visibility public relations management can be over a long enough timeline, jewelry included. Part 30, a title. Nobody. Quite agreed. On the question of exactly what Camilla would be called, both as Charles's wife and eventually as his queen, turned out to be almost as fraught and carefully negotiated as any individual piece of jewelry discussed in this film, and it's worth understanding the full arc of that negotiation because it illuminates just how sensitive every single symbolic choice around Camilla has had to be for 2 full decades running. At the time of their 2005 wedding, Clarence House issued statements indicating that Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen, once Charles eventually became king, a carefully worded compromise designed specifically to avoid the appearance of Camilla claiming the exact title, Princess of Wales, that remained so closely and permanently associated with Diana in the public imagination, even though, in strict legal and constitutional terms, she did in fact hold that title throughout Charles's decades as heir apparent, simply choosing, out of evidence sensitivity, not to use it in public.
That carefully negotiated compromise held for the better part of 2 decades, right up until February 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II, in a personal statement issued to mark her Platinum Jubilee, explicitly stated her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when Charles eventually became king. A statement that effectively settled, with the Queen's own direct personal authority, a question that had been left deliberately ambiguous for 17 years. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary gesture made by an elderly monarch just months before her own death, and it reads, in retrospect, as perhaps the single clearest public signal Elizabeth II ever gave of her own genuine acceptance of Camilla, after decades of far more ambiguous, carefully neutral public positioning. Whatever the Queen privately felt about the entire Charles and Camilla saga across the decades, and by most credible historical accounts, her feelings evolved considerably over time, from evident discomfort in the 1990s to a much warmer, more settled acceptance in her final years. This single statement did more to formally elevate Camilla's status than any jewellery choice, tiara appearance, or state banquet ever could. I think this detail matters enormously for understanding the jewellery story we've spent this entire film unpacking, because it reframes the entire question of institutional legitimacy. Camilla's right to eventually wear the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, or the Greville pieces, or any of the Queen's own most personally significant jewellery, doesn't rest on some vague, contested notion of what she deserves relative to Diana. It rests on an explicit, personal, unambiguous statement made by Elizabeth II herself, in her own words, mere months before her death. The clearest possible institutional blessing a sitting monarch can give. Whatever anyone thinks of how Camilla arrived at this position, she arrived there with the direct, deliberate endorsement of the one woman whose opinion, in this specific institutional context, mattered more than anyone else's. Part 31. What this might mean for the next Queen. It's worth turning briefly toward the future, because the same mechanism that determined what Camilla did and didn't inherit from Elizabeth II will in time determine exactly the same questions for Catherine, Princess of Wales, once Charles's own reign eventually ends and William succeeds him. Catherine currently wears, as we've discussed extensively in earlier chapters of this broader documentary series, a mixture of pieces genuinely associated with Diana: the sapphire engagement ring, the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, alongside institutional pieces lent to her, personally by Elizabeth II during the final decade of the late Queen's own reign, including Queen Mary's bracelet and the Greville chandelier earrings that once belonged to the same Margaret Greville whose bequest anchors so much of this film. What Catherine has not yet inherited, and cannot inherit until Camilla herself either dies or steps back from public jewellery wearing entirely, is any of the institutional collection currently associated specifically with Camilla's own tenure as Queen. The Belgian sapphires, the Brazilian aquamarines, the Rothschild brooch, and the Girls of Great Britain tiara that Camilla now wears as her own signature piece. Exactly the same mechanism that left Diana waiting for jewellery the Queen Mother wouldn't release until 2002, and that left Camilla waiting until 2022 for jewellery Elizabeth II had personally worn for 70 years, will presumably leave Catherine waiting for however long Camilla remains alive and active in public life, regardless of how long that period turns out to be. This is simply how the mechanism has always worked, across every single generation we've discussed in this documentary, stretching back to Queen Victoria's own decades of personal unshared custodianship over her own enormous collection. It's tempting, and I think ultimately mistaken, to read this as some kind of injustice being visited specifically on Catherine, the way it's so often read as an injustice visited specifically on Diana. It's simply the mechanism itself, indifferent to any individual's feelings, functioning exactly as it has for 2 centuries. Catherine will, in time, inherit an enormous collection of extraordinary jewellery, including pieces that today feel entirely, inseparably associated with Camilla, in exactly the same way Camilla eventually inherited pieces that had once felt entirely, inseparably associated with Elizabeth II. The timeline of that inheritance depends entirely on questions of health, longevity, and simple chance that no one, least of all the women involved, has any real control over. The same cold, patient, entirely impersonal arithmetic that has governed every single jewellery transition in this family for as long as anyone has been paying attention. Part 32. The necklace that became a brooch, and why that detail enraged people. There's one specific controversy from this story that deserves a much closer look than the surface-level headline usually allows, because the details of exactly what happened reveal something important about how easily a factually neutral event can be transformed, through repetition and outrage, into something that reads as far more damning than it actually is. In 2016, Camilla was photographed wearing an emerald and diamond piece that had, in an earlier form, been worn by Diana decades before, and the immediate reaction across social media and portions of the tabloid press was fierce, framed explicitly in terms of theft and disrespect, with commentary suggesting Camilla had taken not just Charles, but Diana's jewellery too. What actually happened, once you trace the piece's documented history, rather than the outrage it generated, is considerably less dramatic. The emerald and diamond piece in question was, by most credible jewellery history accounts, originally loaned to Diana by the Queen during her marriage, meaning it was never Diana's personal property to begin with, any more than the Prince of Wales' feather brooch discussed earlier in this film was hers outright. It returned to the institutional royal collection upon Diana's death, exactly as protocol dictated, and sat there for years before eventually being worn again by the woman who now held the position that made such institutional pieces available to her. Diana wore it as a necklace. Camilla, or the piece's own maintenance and restyling process over the intervening years, presented at least one version of it reworked into a brooch, a detail that some outraged commentary treated as an additional insult, as though altering the piece's form were itself a kind of erasure of Diana's memory, when in fact reworking royal jewellery between different forms, as we've seen throughout this entire documentary with pieces like the removable Edwardian ruby tiara necklace, has always been standard practice across generations, entirely independent of any specific grudge against any specific woman. I include this example specifically because it's such a clean illustration of the gap between how these stories actually unfold and how they get processed publicly. A piece of institutional jewellery, on loan to one royal wife, returns to the vault upon her death, sits for years, gets reworked slightly in form, the way countless royal jewels have been reworked across centuries, and eventually reappears on the next woman who holds a role entitling her to wear from that same institutional collection. Told plainly, in that order, it's almost aggressively unremarkable, the kind of thing that happens to royal jewellery constantly, in every generation, without anyone particularly noticing, unless the 2 women involved happen to occupy such emotionally loaded positions in the public imagination that any overlap at all reads a scandal. Part 33. Why this story generates so much more heat than the facts justify. It's worth asking directly, at this point in the film, why the Camilla-Diana jewellery comparison generates such disproportionate outrage relative to the actual documented facts we've spent this entire documentary establishing, because I don't think the answer is simply that people are misinformed, though that's certainly part of it. I think the deeper answer has to do with the specific emotional architecture the British and international press built around Diana during her lifetime, and even more intensely after her death, an architecture that cast her explicitly and repeatedly as a wronged, tragic figure, a genuinely good woman undone by an institution and a rival who never deserved her husband's affection in the first place. Once that narrative architecture is in place, deeply embedded across decades of tabloid coverage, documentaries, films, and even the eventual dramatisation of her life in popular television, almost any subsequent action by Camilla gets processed through that same emotional lens, regardless of its actual factual content. A tiara that Diana never had access to for entirely mundane reasons of institutional timing gets reported and received as though it were a direct insult to her memory, because the underlying narrative structure the public has absorbed over decades primes every single data point to confirm the same story. Wronged princess, undeserving rival, ongoing injustice. It's a remarkably effective narrative engine, precisely because it doesn't require any individual story to actually hold up to close factual scrutiny in order to feel true. It only requires enough surface-level pattern matching, Camilla wearing anything however distantly connected to Diana, to trigger an emotional response that has already been thoroughly primed by everything that came before it.
This isn't to say Diana's treatment during her marriage or the genuine pain caused by Charles and Camilla's affair wasn't real, or that the public's affection for Diana wasn't entirely earned through her own genuine charisma, charitable work, and evident warmth toward ordinary people. All of that is true, and none of it is undermined by the more mundane, less dramatic reality of how royal jewelry succession actually works. But it's worth separating the two questions clearly: whether Diana was treated badly by her husband and by an institution slow to adapt to her genuine popularity is a real serious question with a real serious answer. Whether Camilla specifically stole, denied, or otherwise wrongfully claimed Diana's rightful jewelry inheritance is a much narrower, much more factual question, and on the specific evidence we've walked through across this entire documentary, the honest answer is considerably more boring than the outrage suggests. Part 34. The tabloid economics of a story that never gets old. There's a cynical but, I think, entirely accurate observation worth making about why this particular story, Camilla wearing something Diana theoretically should have worn, keeps getting written and rewritten year after year, regardless of how many times the underlying facts have already been established. It is quite simply an extraordinarily efficient piece of content. It requires almost no original research, since the same handful of facts and photographs get recycled from one outlet to the next. It generates reliably strong engagement because it taps directly into an emotional narrative the audience has already internalized over decades, requiring no additional context or setup before triggering a reaction. And it can be endlessly repackaged with only minor variation, a new tiara here, a newly rediscovered brooch there, while telling essentially the same story every single time. Compare this to the considerably more labor-intensive work of actually tracing a specific piece's provenance back through Boucheron's 1919 workshop records, or cross-referencing exactly when the Queen Mother inherited a given item versus when Elizabeth II did, or establishing definitively whether a particular piece was ever at any point realistically available to Diana during her marriage. That kind of research, the kind this documentary has tried to do throughout, takes considerably more effort, produces a much less emotionally satisfying headline, and crucially, often arrives at a conclusion that undercuts the very outrage that made the story clickable in the first place. It should not be surprising, given ordinary commercial incentives, that the simpler, more emotionally satisfying version of this story gets told far more often than the more complicated, better researched one. I don't say this to suggest that anyone reacting emotionally to these stories is foolish, or that their feelings about Diana or about the broader question of how this family has treated the women who've married into it are somehow illegitimate. I say it because understanding the economic incentives behind how this specific narrative gets produced and reproduced helps explain why it persists so stubbornly, decades after most of the actual facts have been thoroughly documented by jewelry historians with genuine, careful expertise in exactly this subject. The story that generates outrage is simply more valuable, in a very literal commercial sense, than the story that generates a shrug and a nod toward institutional timing. Part 35. One diamond cut 9 ways, scattered across a century. No account of how diamonds moved through this family would be complete without at least some mention of the Cullinan diamond, whose story sits underneath an enormous portion of what we've discussed throughout this entire documentary without ever quite taking center stage. Discovered in South Africa in 1905, the Cullinan was, at over 3,000 carats in its rough form, the largest gem-quality diamond ever found anywhere in the world. a discovery so significant that the Transvaal colonial government purchased it and presented it to King Edward VII as a birthday gift the following year, in an act of imperial-era diplomacy that would have enormous decades-spanning consequences for exactly the kind of jewelry succession questions this film has spent so much time untangling. The stone was sent to Amsterdam, where the master cutter Joseph Asscher spent months studying it before making the first cut, eventually producing 9 major stones along with numerous smaller fragments, the 2 largest of which, Cullinan I and Cullinan II, were set into the sovereign's scepter and the imperial state crown respectively, becoming permanent inalienable fixtures of the crown jewels proper, the ceremonial regalia that belongs not to any individual monarch personally but to the nation itself, passed automatically with the throne regardless of who occupies it. The smaller Cullinan stones, however, including Cullinan III, IV, V, and beyond, were set into brooches, necklaces, and other personal jewelry pieces that Queen Mary herself commissioned and wore extensively, and which then passed as personal property rather than inalienable crown jewels, according to the same individual inheritance patterns we've traced throughout every other piece in this documentary. Queen Elizabeth II was famously photographed wearing the Cullinan V heart-shaped diamond brooch at the Royal Windsor Horse Show in 1980, one of countless occasions across her 70-year reign when she reached for this particular stone from her own personal collection, and it was stones from this same Cullinan family, rather than the historically contested Koh-i-Noor, that were specifically chosen to reset Queen Mary's crown for Camilla's own coronation in 2023. This detail matters because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the exact legal and symbolic distinction that runs underneath this entire film. Some diamonds belong to the nation permanently, regardless of who sits on the throne, while others, cut from the very same original stone, become personal property, inherited according to individual wishes and circumstance, entirely subject to the same patient, sometimes decades-long waiting game that determined when Camilla could finally wear pieces Elizabeth II had held onto for the whole of her own reign. Part 36, the jeweler who built half of this story, Gerard, the firm that appears again and again throughout this documentary, crafting Queen Mary's bandeau tiara in 1932, the lover's knot tiara decades earlier, and countless other pieces scattered across this entire collection, holds a position in British royal jewelry history that deserves its own explicit acknowledgement, because so much of what we've discussed exists specifically because of this. One company's decades of continuous royal patronage, Gerard served as the official crown jeweler for well over a century, a formal royal appointment that gave the firm privileged ongoing access to reworking, resetting, and recommissioning pieces from the royal collection across generations, meaning that an enormous number of the tiaras and parures we've discussed throughout this film share not just royal ownership but a specific continuous design lineage running through the same craftsman's hands. This matters for understanding why certain pieces feel stylistically related, even when their component gemstones have entirely separate, unrelated origins. Gerard's house style, evolving gradually across the decades from Victorian Romanticism through Edwardian grandeur into the geometric precision of Art Deco design, left its unmistakable fingerprint on nearly every major royal commission for the better part of 150 years, meaning that Queen Mary's bandeau, the lover's knot, and numerous other pieces in this documentary share a coherent design vocabulary, specifically because they emerge from the same workshop tradition, refined and passed down between generations of the same firm's craftsmen, rather than commissioned independently from a scattered array of competing jewelers. Gerard eventually lost its formal crown jeweler status in 2007, ending a royal warrant that had by that point run for well over a century and a half, a change that reflects broader shifts in how the modern monarchy manages its commercial and ceremonial relationships, but it does nothing to diminish the firm's enormous foundational influence over nearly everything discussed in this film. Understanding Gerard's role helps clarify something important about how this collection actually came to exist in its current form. It wasn't simply an accumulation of unrelated gifts and purchases scattered randomly across centuries, but a coherent, continuously curated body of work shaped by one firm's craftsmen working, generation after generation, for the same family, on commissions that would eventually become the very objects at the center of this entire documentary's central question.
Part 37. A French rival and the Russian style that followed. Where Garrard represented continuity and English institutional tradition, the French houses that also contributed significantly to this collection, Boucheron and Cartier, chief among them, brought something rather different, a cosmopolitan, continental sensibility shaped heavily by the influx of exiled Russian aristocratic taste following the 1917 revolution. Exactly the aesthetic current that produced both Greville Emerald Kokoshnik pieces we've discussed at length throughout this film. Boucheron, the house responsible for the Emerald Kokoshnik itself, had built its reputation throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries on serving European royalty and the aristocracy of Imperial Russia directly, giving the firm an intimate, specialised familiarity with exactly the Kokoshnik silhouette and cabochon gemstone treatments that would later define so much of what Margaret Greville commissioned and eventually bequeathed to the Queen Mother. Cartier, meanwhile, whose own chandelier earrings and other pieces feature prominently throughout the broader story of this family's jewellery across multiple documentaries in this series, built its reputation on precisely engineered, geometrically ambitious Art Deco design, work that appealed enormously to wealthy society hostesses like Greville, whose personal fortune and social ambitions made her exactly the kind of client these houses most wanted to cultivate. It's worth understanding that the presence of both French houses in this collection reflects something specific about early 20th century taste among wealthy, socially ambitious British women, who increasingly looked to Paris rather than London for their most ambitious personal jewellery commissions, even as the formal royal collection itself remained anchored by Garrard's more traditionally English commissions. This international dimension matters for the broader story this documentary tells, because it means the collection Camilla eventually inherited isn't simply a monolithic British royal jewellery tradition, but a genuinely layered, cosmopolitan assemblage, English craftsmanship from Garrard, French Art Deco ambition from Cartier, Russian-influenced grandeur from Boucheron, all filtered through the personal tastes of a series of individual women across more than a century, each adding their own commissions, purchases and bequests to a collection that has never stopped growing, evolving and occasionally, as we've seen with the Emerald Kokoshnik, falling almost entirely out of public memory for decades, at a stretch before being rediscovered by whoever happens to be searching through the vault next. Part 38. Two very different kinds of ownership. There's a legal and constitutional distinction sitting underneath this entire documentary that rarely gets spelled out clearly, and understanding it properly clears up a great deal of the confusion that fuels so much of the online outrage we've discussed. The crown jewels proper, the imperial state crown, St. Edward's crown, the sovereign's sceptre with its Cullinan one diamond, the sovereign's orb, are not personal property in any conventional sense at all. They belong to the crown as an institution, held in trust for the nation, passed automatically to whoever occupies the throne, and never subject to individual inheritance, sale, or personal bequest in the way ordinary property is. No monarch has ever had the legal right to leave these specific objects to a favourite grandchild, sell them to fund a passion project, or otherwise treat them as their own private possessions, because in the strictest constitutional sense, they never were. Everything else we've discussed throughout this film, the Greville tiaras, the Belgian sapphires, Queen Mary's own personal jewellery collection, the aquamarines gifted to Elizabeth II at her coronation, falls into an entirely different legal category, generally referred to as the sovereign's private collection, or occasionally as personal gifts and heirlooms, property that is genuinely legally owned by the individual monarch or consort in question, in exactly the same way any private citizen owns their own jewellery, subject to the same rules of personal inheritance, bequest and disposal that would govern any other family's estate. This is precisely why Elizabeth II could personally decide to leave certain pieces to specific family members in her private will. Why the Queen Mother could specifically bequeath her Greville inheritance according to her own wishes, and why the entire question of who gets what in this documentary has never been a matter of fixed institutional rule, but of individual, sometimes quite personal decision-making by whoever happened to own the pieces at the time. Understanding this distinction reframes almost everything discussed throughout this film. The reason Diana never had guaranteed access to the Greville pieces, the Belgian sapphires, or the Girls of Great Britain tiara, isn't because some formal rule of succession excluded her specifically. It's because these pieces were never public property to begin with, no more subject to automatic redistribution among royal wives than any private citizen's jewellery box would be subject to automatic redistribution among their own in-laws. Elizabeth II owned this jewellery personally, wore it according to her own taste, and eventually passed it on according to her own wishes. Precisely the same freedom any of us would expect to exercise over our own genuinely private property, however much more valuable and historically significant that property happens to be compared to the average person's jewellery box. Part 39. What happens next and who decides? This same private, individually controlled system means that the eventual disposition of Camilla's own current jewellery collection, whenever that question eventually arises, will be determined largely by her own personal wishes, expressed through whatever private arrangements she chooses to make, rather than by any fixed institutional formula guaranteeing automatic transfer to Catherine or to any other specific family member. Camilla could, in theory, choose to leave specific pieces to her own children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, exactly as she has already lent the cubit shand tiara to Laura for her own wedding, a choice entirely within her legal rights regarding property that is genuinely, personally hers, separate from anything she holds only as Queen Consort during her lifetime. The more institutionally significant pieces, the Greville jewels, the Girls of Great Britain tiara, the various aquamarine and sapphire sets discussed throughout this film, will presumably follow the same pattern that has governed every previous transition we've examined, passing eventually to whoever occupies the position of Queen Consort or Queen Regnant next, most likely Catherine, once Charles's reign ends and Camilla either predeceases him or steps back from these ceremonial obligations. But it's worth being honest about the fact that this presumption, however historically well supported, isn't actually guaranteed by any fixed rule. Elizabeth II's own will, notably, remains sealed and confidential, as is customary for reigning monarchs, meaning the public genuinely does not know the full precise legal mechanics of exactly how her jewellery collection was formally distributed to Charles and, through him, to Camilla. We know only what has subsequently appeared in public, on Camilla's body, at state occasions, which tells us what she wears, but not necessarily the complete legal picture of who technically owns what. This uncertainty is worth sitting with, because it means the entire documentary you've just watched, however carefully researched and factually grounded in publicly available information, is ultimately reconstructing a private legal reality from its public, visible symptoms. From photographs, from royal historians' careful tracking of individual pieces across decades, from the rare official palace statement confirming a specific provenance. The actual, complete legal truth of who owns what, and under what precise conditions, remains locked away in documents that the public, and frankly people making documentaries like this one, will likely never see in full. What we can say with confidence is what has been worn, by whom and when, and from that visible record, the pattern we've traced throughout this film holds remarkably consistent, even if its precise legal underpinnings remain, by design, somewhat opaque. Part 40. What a piece of jewellery actually remembers. Step back. Far enough from the individual tiaras, brooches and controversies we've spent this entire documentary examining, and a broader, more philosophical question emerges. One that I think deserves genuine consideration rather than simply being waved away as too abstract for a film ostensibly about diamonds. Why does any of this matter so much to so many people, decades after the events themselves, to individuals who never met either woman and have no personal stake whatsoever in the outcome? I think the answer has to do with what jewellery, uniquely among nearly all categories of human object, is actually capable of doing. It survives physically essentially unchanged across timescales that dwarf any individual human life, carrying forward a kind of continuity that photographs fade from, that written records get reinterpreted and argued over, but that a physical diamond cut once and worn by generation after generation of women simply cannot fully escape.
When Camilla wears a brooch that Diana once wore, she isn't simply making a fashion choice. She's placing her own body, quite literally, inside an object that has already absorbed and reflected the public gaze directed at another woman in the same role doing the same symbolic work years or decades earlier. The diamond doesn't care who's wearing it. It reflects the same light regardless. But the person watching cannot help but see both women simultaneously, layered on top of each other through the medium of a single unchanging object. And that layering, that involuntary act of historical superimposition, is precisely what makes royal jewelry succession feel so much more emotionally loaded than the equivalent question would feel for almost any other category of inherited property. Nobody gets outraged watching a new king move into an old palace, however much history that building has witnessed. But watching a new woman wear the exact same tiara that once sat on a beloved, tragically lost predecessor's head triggers something that feels, and in a strange physical sense actually is, much more intimate. This, I think, is the real reason this specific category of royal story, who wore what and when and whether it was fair, never seems to lose its capacity to generate genuine emotional reaction, however many times the underlying facts get carefully, patiently explained. Jewelry is memory made physical, worn on a living body, in full public view, in a way that almost nothing else in human material culture manages to replicate quite so directly. Diana has been dead for nearly 3 decades. But every single time a diamond that once caught the light on her wedding day, her wedding tour, her final years of freedom, catches the light again on someone else's body, some part of the watching public experiences a small involuntary act of resurrection, and no amount of patient historical explanation about institutional timing and legal ownership categories will ever fully dissolve that particular very human reaction. Part 41, Rank Not Rivalry, What the Wider Family Reveals. If the Camilla versus Diana framing were actually the correct way to understand how this jewelry moves through the family, we would expect to see a similar pattern of contested inheritance and public outrage surrounding every other royal wife's jewelry access across this same period, and we simply don't, which is itself some of the strongest evidence available that rank and timing, rather than personal rivalry, explain almost everything we've discussed in this film. Princess Anne, Elizabeth II's only daughter and a full generation closer in blood to the Queen than either Diana or Camilla ever was, has never worn the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, never worn the bulk of the Greville collection, and has generally been photographed in a comparatively modest, consistent rotation of her own jewelry across her entire adult life, despite occupying a position of genuine closeness to her mother that neither Diana nor Camilla, as in-laws rather than blood relatives, ever quite matched. Sarah Ferguson, during her own marriage to Prince Andrew, wore the York tiara for her wedding, a piece given to her outright as a gift rather than lent, one of the rare pieces in this entire documentary scope that was never subject to the return upon divorce protocol that governed Diana's own wedding tiara. But she was never lent the kind of grand, historically loaded institutional pieces that eventually made their way to Diana and later to Catherine, reflecting her own more distant, more turbulent relationship with the family following her own divorce. Princess Beatrice in 2018 was permitted to wear the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik Tiara for her wedding, precisely because, as a genuine blood granddaughter of the Queen, her rank within the family carried a different, more secure kind of automatic access than any in-law, however beloved or however long-serving, has ever quite enjoyed. The pattern that emerges from surveying the entire extended family, rather than fixating exclusively on the 2 women whose story generates the most tabloid heat, is precisely the pattern this documentary has argued throughout. Institutional jewelry access in this family correlates overwhelmingly with rank, proximity to the throne, and simple individual timing, rather than with any deliberate campaign of favor or exclusion aimed at any specific woman. Diana didn't miss out on certain pieces because Camilla or the institution disliked her specifically. She missed out for precisely the same structural reasons that have determined access for every single royal wife across multiple generations, reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with personal animus and everything to do with an ancient, thoroughly impersonal system of inherited private property, moving according to its own patient, glacial rhythm regardless of who happens to be waiting. Part 42. What this story actually leaves us. With having spent this entire documentary tracing individual tiaras back through Boucheron's Paris workshop, Gerard's century and a half as crown jeweler, Margaret Greville's remarkable and complicated life, Alice Keppel's own scandalous affair with a different king a century earlier, and the slow, patient, decades-long mechanism by which an enormous private jewelry collection moves from one woman's hands to the next, only when death or abdication finally forces the transfer, I think it's worth returning one final time to the question the title of this film actually poses. What did Queen Camilla inherit that Diana never got to wear? The honest, fully researched answer turns out to be considerably less dramatic and considerably more interesting than the headline promises. Almost everything Camilla wears today that Diana never wore falls into one of a small number of thoroughly mundane categories. Jewelry the reigning queen was still actively wearing herself throughout Diana's entire marriage. Jewelry that had fallen out of public circulation for decades before Diana ever arrived, for reasons no one has ever fully explained. Jewelry given as gifts specifically and personally addressed to Elizabeth II, never intended for general circulation at all. And an entirely separate category of Camilla's own family jewelry, connected to the Cubits, the Shands, and Alice Keppel, that was never institutional property to begin with, and could never have been available to Diana under any circumstances, no matter how long she had lived or how the family's internal politics had unfolded. The genuine overlap, the single brooch tied directly to the Prince of Wales title that both women have unmistakably worn in the same role, stands out precisely because it's the exception, not the rule, in a much larger, much less dramatic pattern of institutional timing and simple, patient, impersonal succession. None of this is meant to diminish what Diana meant, and continues to mean, to millions of people who watched her navigate an institution that was, by almost every honest historical account, slow, cold, and often genuinely unkind to her during a marriage that caused her real, lasting pain. It's meant instead to separate two questions that popular retelling has spent decades collapsing into one. Whether Diana was treated well by her husband and by the family and institution she married into is a real and serious question, with an answer that reflects genuinely poorly on several of the people involved. Whether Camilla specifically deliberately claimed jewelry that was rightfully Diana's is a much narrower, much more factual question. And on the evidence this documentary has spent so long assembling, from Boucheron workshop records to jewelry historians' careful decades-long tracking of individual pieces, the honest answer is that almost none of it was. Diana simply lived at the wrong moment in an extraordinarily long, patient cycle of inheritance that has been turning, largely unchanged, for the better part of 2 centuries. A cycle that, in time, will hand Camilla's own current jewelry onward to someone else entirely, according to exactly the same cold, indifferent, endlessly patient logic that governed everything we've traced across this film. Part 43. The full ledger laid out. Plainly before closing, it's worth assembling everything this documentary has traced into a single, plain chronological ledger, because the sheer accumulation of dates and handoffs makes the underlying pattern far more visible than any single anecdote can manage on its own. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara arrives as a wedding gift in 1893, becomes Elizabeth II's signature piece by the 1950s, remains in her personal rotation for the following 7 decades, and only reaches Camilla in 2023 after the Queen's death the previous year. The Greville diamond tiara and its full parure arrived through Margaret Greville's 1942 bequest to the Queen Mother, remain hers until her own death in 2002, pass briefly through Elizabeth II's ownership, and reach Camilla by 2007, worn publicly for the first time on that state visit to Uganda. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik arrives through the same 1942 bequest, is worn by no one in any documented public appearance for over 50 years, resurfaces briefly on Princess Eugenie in 2018 as a wedding loan, and separately reaches Camilla's own rotation in the years following.
The Belgian sapphire tiara is purchased by Elizabeth II in the 1960s from an entirely separate, unrelated aristocratic collection, remains part of her personal George VI Victorian suite for 6 decades, and reaches Camilla only after 2022. The Brazilian aquamarine parure arrives as a personal coronation gift in 1953, is expanded and personally curated by Elizabeth II across 3 subsequent decades, and only becomes available to Camilla after the same 2022 transition. The Rothschild diamond watch brooch arrives as a wedding gift in 1893, is worn twice across the following 4 decades by 2 different women, then vanishes from public view entirely for 89 years before Camilla rediscovers and wears it in 2025. And running alongside every single one of these institutional threads entirely separately, the Cubit Shan tiara moves quietly through Camilla's own bloodline from 1973 onward. The Keppel tiara moves through a jewellery market reassembly project undertaken personally by Charles on Camilla's behalf, and the Prince of Wales feather brooch moves from Queen Alexandra in 1863 to Diana in 1981 to Camilla in the 2000s, remaining throughout that entire span the singular clear exception to everything else on this list. Laid out this way, stripped of headline and outrage, the pattern becomes almost mechanically clear. Every single major transition in this entire documentary happens at the exact moment a previous owner dies, or a reign changes hands, never before, and never according to any calculation involving which daughter-in-law deserves what relative to another. Diana's marriage, spanning 1981 to 1997, sits entirely within a long, uninterrupted stretch of Elizabeth II's and the Queen Mother's own personal ownership over nearly everything discussed in this film. Camilla's marriage, spanning 2005 onward, happens to straddle exactly the moment when both of those long ownership periods finally inevitably ended. That is not favouritism. That is simply what a timeline looks like when you actually write every single date down in order, rather than relying on memory, impression, and the emotionally loaded shorthand that has governed this story in the popular imagination for the better part of 2 decades. Part 44, A Queen Consort, trying to build something of her own. It would be incomplete to close this documentary purely on the question of inherited jewellery, without at least acknowledging the broader project Camilla has spent the last 2 decades attempting to build for herself, independent of any comparison to her predecessor, because it offers useful context for understanding why her jewellery choices have so often leaned toward quiet continuity rather than any attempt to outshine or overwrite what came before. Since her marriage in 2005, and considerably more visibly since becoming Queen Consort in 2022, Camilla has built a public role centred heavily on literacy advocacy, having launched and sustained a long-running reading initiative aimed at encouraging both children and adults to develop a lasting love of books, alongside sustained, publicly visible advocacy around domestic violence and sexual abuse survivors, causes she has spoken about with what many observers have described as genuine, evident personal conviction, rather than the more generic, arm's-length charitable patronage that sometimes characterises royal involvement in difficult social issues. This matters for understanding the jewellery story specifically because it reflects a broader pattern in how Camilla appears to have approached her entire public role. Not by attempting to compete with or overwrite Diana's own enormously popular, deeply personal public image, built as it was around hospital visits, landmine awareness campaigns, and an almost unprecedented physical warmth toward the ordinary people she met, but by carving out an adjacent, somewhat different lane entirely, built around causes that reflect her own genuine interests, and by most credible accounts, her own personal history and temperament. The same instinct that led her to choose the George VI Victorian suite for her very first state banquet as Queen, rather than something flashier and more attention-grabbing, appears to run through her broader approach to the role itself, measured, careful, oriented toward quiet continuity rather than dramatic reinvention, an approach shaped almost certainly by the hard lessons of 2 decades spent rebuilding a public reputation that began in the late 1990s, about as low as any living royal figure's reputation has ever sunk. Whether this approach amounts to genuine humility, careful political calculation, or some combination of both is ultimately a matter of interpretation that reasonable people can disagree about. And this documentary has no special authority to settle that particular question definitively. But it's worth noting as a final piece of context before we close, that the same woman whose jewellery choices we've spent this entire film demonstrating were shaped overwhelmingly by institutional timing rather than personal ambition has, across the whole of her public career, generally displayed exactly that same pattern in nearly everything else she's chosen to do. Waiting, watching, moving carefully, and only when the moment genuinely seemed to call for it, rather than reaching for whatever grand gesture might generate the most immediate attention. It's a pattern consistent enough, across enough different domains of her public life, that it seems worth taking seriously as a genuine character trait, rather than dismissing it as simply the fortunate cover story for a woman who otherwise helped herself to whatever she pleased. Part 45. A pattern that extends well beyond one family. It's worth briefly widening the frame beyond the British royal family entirely, because the same fundamental mechanism we've spent this documentary tracing, personal jewellery belonging to whoever occupies the throne, released to the next generation only upon death or abdication, rather than shared or distributed according to any sense of fairness among royal wives generally, governs jewellery succession across nearly every European monarchy that has survived into the modern era, each with its own version of the same essential drama playing out on a smaller, less globally scrutinised scale. Sweden's royal family maintains its own extensive collection of historic tiaras, several with documented histories stretching back through Napoleonic-era gifts and 19th century dynastic marriages, worn according to a rotation that similarly depends heavily on which specific woman currently holds which specific rank within the family, rather than any shared communal access. The Dutch, Spanish and Danish royal houses each maintain broadly comparable systems, with their own long-serving queens and queens consort holding on to specific, personally significant pieces for decades at a time before those pieces become available to the next generation, and each of these families has, at various points, generated its own smaller-scale version of exactly the kind of who wore what and when controversy this documentary has spent so long examining in the British context. None of these other examples have generated anything approaching the sustained, decades-long public fascination that the British case has produced, and the reason for that difference has almost nothing to do with jewellery succession mechanics themselves, which are broadly similar across all these monarchies, and everything to do with the specific, extraordinary global fame Diana achieved during her own lifetime, a level of international celebrity that no other European royal consort of her generation, before or since, has ever quite matched. This wider context matters because it reinforces, one final time, the central argument this documentary has tried to make throughout. The mechanism governing Camilla's jewellery inheritance is not some unusual, specifically British, specifically Windsor family aberration invented to disadvantage Diana personally. It is the ordinary, unremarkable way jewellery succession has worked across essentially every surviving European monarchy for as long as any of them have existed in anything resembling their modern form. What makes the British case feel so uniquely dramatic is not the mechanism itself, but the singular, once-in-a-generation intensity of public feeling that one specific woman, at one specific moment in the late 20th century, managed to generate around herself, a feeling so powerful that it has continued to reshape how an entirely ordinary institutional process gets perceived, discussed, and endlessly relitigated more than a quarter century after her death. Part 46. What jewellery reveals about who actually holds power. There's one final thread worth pulling before we close, because it connects the entire documentary back to something larger than any individual tiara or brooch. What this whole story reveals about where genuine power actually sits within a monarchy that likes to present itself, in public, as a fixed hierarchy of clearly defined roles. On paper, the Princess of Wales and the Queen Consort occupy clearly ranked positions, with the reigning monarch's own wife theoretically outranking the wife of the heir apparent in every formal sense that matters. but the jewellery story we've traced across this entire film reveals something more interesting sitting underneath that formal hierarchy. Real access to the most significant pieces in this collection has never actually tracked title alone. It has tracked something closer to simple biological survival. Who is still alive and still willing to wear a given piece at the moment a formal transition of power finally occurs. Elizabeth II held onto her own signature tiara for 70 years, not because any rule of succession required her to, but because she was quite simply the one wearing it, for as long as she remained alive and willing to do so, regardless of how many daughters-in-law, granddaughters, or nieces might have enjoyed wearing it themselves during that same stretch of decades. The Queen Mother held onto her own Greville inheritance for 60 years for exactly the same reason. Real power over this specific category of property, in other words, has never really belonged to whoever holds the more senior title on paper. It has belonged, throughout every single generation this documentary has examined, to whoever simply outlives everyone else currently standing in line, a form of power that has nothing to do with constitutional rank and everything to do with the entirely unglamorous, endlessly patient arithmetic of human mortality. I think there's something genuinely worth sitting with in that realisation, because it cuts against nearly every popular assumption about how royal hierarchy actually functions. We tend to imagine institutions like the British monarchy as rigid, rule-bound structures, where everyone's position and entitlements are fixed and clearly defined well in advance. The jewellery story tells a different, more human tale. An institution where the most treasured, most historically significant objects belong in practice to whoever happens to still be standing when the music finally stops, regardless of how carefully anyone else might have planned, hoped, or felt entitled to something different. Diana didn't lose this particular game because anyone cheated. She lost it, if lost is even the right word for something this impersonal, because she died young, and the women who eventually inherited what she never got to wear simply had the good fortune or the sheer patience to still be standing decades later when the collection finally inevitably changed hands. Part 47. The design history behind the Queen's own favourite. It's worth returning in more detail than we managed earlier to the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara itself, because its own design history contains a small drama of its own that mirrors nearly everything else this documentary has traced. The tiara was originally commissioned in a slightly different form in 1893, funded through a public subscription raised specifically by British girls and young women as a wedding gift for the future Queen Mary, then still Princess May of Teck, upon her marriage to the future King George V. Queen Mary herself, ever the meticulous collector and frequent redesigner of her own jewellery, had the piece reworked in 1914, removing its original pearl surmounts and replacing them with diamonds sourced, according to several jewellery historians, from pieces already in her own personal collection. A small act of continuous curation entirely characteristic of a woman who spent her entire adult life treating her jewellery collection as something closer to an ongoing creative project than a static set of finished objects. Queen Mary later gave the tiara to her granddaughter, the future Elizabeth II, as a wedding gift in 1947, a full generation before Diana would even be born. And Elizabeth II wore it so consistently across the following decades that it eventually became, by broad consensus among royal jewellery historians, the single most instantly recognisable tiara associated with her entire reign, appearing on countless official portraits, on coinage, and in the public imagination as something close to visual shorthand for the monarch herself. This detail matters because it underscores, one final time, just how completely unavailable this specific piece was to Diana throughout her entire marriage. It wasn't merely that Elizabeth II happened to prefer wearing it. It was that the tiara had, by the 1980s, become something close to a visual extension of the Queen's own public identity, worn with the kind of unthinking, habitual regularity that most of us reserve for a wedding ring, rather than a formal piece of state jewellery. Asking why Diana never wore it is a little like asking why a serving president never wore his predecessor's own signature wristwatch. The question answers itself once you understand how thoroughly the object and the person had become intertwined in the public mind. Camilla's decision to specifically reach for this tiara at Charles's coronation in 2023, rather than commissioning something new or reaching for one of the many other pieces now technically available to her, reads against this backdrop, as a considered, almost reverent gesture, rather than an act of casual appropriation. She was not simply choosing a pretty tiara from an enormous available selection. She was choosing the one piece most thoroughly, unmistakably associated with the woman whose reign had just ended, whose direct personal statement in 2022 had authorised Camilla's own title as Queen, and whose approval, by every credible account, mattered enormously to Camilla across the entire final chapter of Elizabeth II's long life. It is difficult to read that specific choice as anything other than a deliberate act of homage, made by a woman who understood, with real precision, exactly how much symbolic weight this particular object carried, and who chose to carry that weight forward, rather than set it aside in favour of something less historically loaded. Part 48, Kokoshniks, courtly fashion, and a silhouette that outlived an empire. The Kokoshnik style itself deserves one final moment of attention before we move toward this documentary's close, because its own journey from Russian peasant headdress to European high society staple tells a story about fashion, empire, and cultural borrowing that runs underneath nearly every tiara we've discussed in this film. The Kokoshnik, in its original form, was a traditional Russian folk headdress worn by married women, its distinctive rounded halo-like arch eventually adopted and reinterpreted by the Russian imperial court throughout the 19th century as a form of aristocratic court dress, a fashion choice that then spread through royal intermarriage and high society emulation into British and broader European aristocratic taste well before the 1917 revolution ever scattered actual Russian imperial jewellery across European markets. Queen Alexandra, whose own 1888 silver wedding anniversary Kokoshnik Tiara Camilla now regularly wears, adopted this specific silhouette decades before the Bolshevik Revolution, made Russian-style jewellery synonymous with tragic imperial exile, choosing it originally simply because it was fashionable among the European aristocratic circles she moved in, connected through her own family ties to the Danish and Russian royal houses. This detail is worth sitting with because it means the Kokoshnik silhouette carries two entirely separate historical registers simultaneously, layered on top of each other in a way that most casual observers never quite untangle. There's the pre-revolutionary register, in which the style simply represents fashionable aristocratic taste, worn by women like Alexandra, with no darker resonance attached at all. And there's the post-revolutionary register, activated specifically by pieces like the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik, in which the exact same silhouette suddenly carries the weight of a murdered imperial family and a vanished aristocratic world, regardless of whether any specific piece actually contains stones that pass through Russian hands at all. Understanding this distinction helps explain something that might otherwise seem contradictory. Why Camilla can wear Queen Alexandra's own 1888 Kokoshnik regularly, without controversy, while the entirely separate Greville Emerald Kokoshnik carries such a specifically loaded, carefully managed history, requiring the kind of provenance sensitivity we discussed at length in this documentary series' earlier chapter on Meghan Markle's own wedding jewellery choices. The shape is the same. The underlying history and the emotional weight that history carries into any room where the piece appears is entirely different. A reminder that in this particular category of object, form and meaning are far more separable than they might initially appear, and that the same fashionable silhouette can carry either genuinely weightless elegance or genuine historical tragedy, depending entirely on which specific stones happen to be set into it and where those specific stones actually came from. Part 49. The vault doesn't take sides. There's a particular image worth returning to as we bring this documentary toward its close, because it captures something true that no single anecdote in this film has quite managed to convey on its own. Beneath Buckingham Palace, in a converted air raid shelter fitted with its own dedicated alarm system, connected directly to an on-site police station, sits a collection of jewellery vast enough that entire categories of extraordinary objects can go unworn, unphotographed and functionally forgotten for the better part of a century, only to resurface, blinking into the light on some entirely unexpected occasion decades later. That vault has no opinion about Diana. It has no opinion about Camilla, or Catherine, or Meghan, or any of the women whose names have become so tightly, emotionally bound to specific pieces within it. It simply holds what it holds, releasing pieces only when the woman who currently controls them lets go, either through choice or through death, in a process that has repeated itself, largely unchanged for the better part of 200 years. Every single controversy this documentary has examined, the timing of the Greville Tiara, the 50-year disappearance of the Emerald Kokoshnik, the 89-year silence of the Rothschild brooch, the singular, genuine overlap of the Prince of Wales feather brooch, happened not because the vault or the institution it represents made any deliberate choice about fairness between two specific women. It happened because the vault simply keeps time indifferently, patiently, for as long as the monarchy itself continues to exist, releasing its contents only according to the oldest, coldest calendar there is, the literal lifespan of whoever happens to be holding the keys. Diana's story within that calendar is genuinely tragic, cut short decades before its natural conclusion, in a way that makes the entire comparison to Camilla, who simply lived long enough to still be present when the calendar finally turned, feel uncomfortable in a manner that has nothing to do with jewellery and everything to do with the basic, unbearable unfairness of an early death. But the jewellery itself, considered plainly, on its own terms, tells a much less dramatic story than the one that generates headlines and viral outrage. It tells the story of an institution that has never actually distinguished between the women who pass through it based on affection, favouritism, or any of the emotionally loaded categories the public tends to project onto it. It has only ever distinguished based on rank, timing, and the simple accident of who is still alive when a previous owner finally, inevitably lets go. That's not a satisfying moral to end on, precisely because it refuses to give anyone a villain to blame or a clean verdict to walk away with. But it happens to be the truth, as best as this documentary has been able to reconstruct it from photographs, jewellery historians' careful decades-long tracking, and the rare official statement. And I think the truth, however unsatisfying, deserves to be told plainly, especially about a story that has spent nearly 3 decades being told almost any other way. Part 49. A note on sources and the limits of what any of us can actually know. Before we close, it's worth being transparent about the nature of the evidence underlying everything this documentary has claimed, because a story built this heavily on jewellery provenance deserves at least some acknowledgement of where that knowledge actually comes from and where its limits sit. Much of what we know about the specific dates, gifts, and inheritances discussed throughout this film comes from a relatively small community of dedicated jewellery historians, writers like Geoffrey Munn, whose landmark book on the history of tiaras remains a foundational reference for anyone trying to trace these pieces seriously, and contemporary jewellery historians and journalists who have spent years cross-referencing court photographs, auction records, and the occasional official palace statement to build up the kind of detailed provenance timeline this documentary has relied on throughout. This is, by its nature, painstaking, somewhat speculative work, reconstructed from the outside rather than confirmed through direct access to private royal wills and inventories, which remain sealed as is customary both for reigning monarchs and, in practice, for most of the private jewellery transactions that happen within the family more broadly. Where this documentary has stated something as established fact, the 1942 Greville bequest, the 1932 construction of Queen Mary's bandeau, the 1980 commissioning of the Nizam's necklace discussed in an earlier chapter of this series. It has done so on the basis of consistent cross-referenced reporting from multiple credible jewellery historians and outlets, the same standard any careful documentary should apply to claims this specific and this old. where the evidence has been thinner, more speculative, or dependent on a single biographer's account, rather than broad consensus. Certain claims about private palace conversations, for instance, or the precise emotional motivations behind specific jewellery choices. This documentary has tried to flag that uncertainty explicitly, rather than presenting speculation with the same confidence as documented fact. I think this distinction matters enormously in a story this emotionally charged, precisely because so much of the popular version of this narrative blurs confirmed fact and plausible speculation together until they become indistinguishable, allowing outrage to attach itself just as easily to a well-documented timeline as to an unverified rumour repeated confidently enough times to start feeling like established truth. This documentary has tried, throughout, to hold that line as carefully as the available evidence allows, acknowledging real uncertainty where it exists, while still being willing to draw the clear, well-supported conclusions that the weight of consistent, credible reporting genuinely does support. Whether it has succeeded in threading that particular needle is, as with everything else in this film, ultimately a judgment left to you, the person who has spent the better part of a long documentary listening to one specific, careful argument about diamonds, timing, and the very human weight of institutional memory. Part 50. A closing thought from one documentary maker to another curious viewer. I want to end this film not with another fact or another tiara or another carefully dated transition of ownership, but with something closer to an honest admission about why stories like this one keep pulling people in, myself very much included, decades after the events themselves. There is something genuinely, almost uncomfortably compelling about watching a physical object outlive the person most associated with it and then reappear on someone else entirely. A small, glittering proof that time keeps moving forward regardless of how frozen any particular moment felt while we were living through it. Diana's death, for an entire generation of people who watched her rise and then grieved her loss in real time, remains one of those rare, genuinely shared cultural memories, a single event that an enormous number of people across the world can recall with startling specific clarity, right down to where they were standing when they heard the news.
Every single piece of jewelry this documentary has traced back through Boucheron's Paris workshop, through Margaret Greville's remarkable Surrey estate, through the quiet, patient decades of Elizabeth II's own personal custodianship, eventually intersects in some way with that same shared cultural memory, which is precisely why a story that is, at its factual core, mostly about wills, timing, and the ordinary mechanics of private property inheritance, manages to feel, on the surface, like something so much larger and more emotionally significant. It isn't really a story about diamonds at all, if we're being completely honest with each other at the end of this long, winding film. It's a story about how an entire watching public processes grief, memory, and the passage of time through the medium of objects that happen to survive far longer than any of the people who once wore them. And Camilla, whatever else you think of her, whatever verdict you've reached across the 90 minutes or so of history we've just walked through together, happens to be the woman standing closest to that memory right now, wearing pieces that carry it forward, whether she asked for that particular kind of scrutiny or not. The vault beneath Buckingham Palace will keep doing exactly what it has always done, long after this documentary is finished, long after every person watching it has moved on to some other story entirely. It will keep its contents in the dark, releasing them only when death or choice finally forces the transfer, indifferent to headlines, indifferent to outrage, indifferent to which specific woman the internet has decided to root for this particular year. Somewhere inside it, right now, there is very likely another piece of jewelry, every bit as historically significant as anything discussed in this film, that hasn't been worn in public for decades, waiting patiently for whichever future queen consort eventually stumbles across it and decides the moment has finally come to bring it back into the light. When that happens, whenever it happens, to whoever it happens to, I suspect we'll all have exactly the same conversation all over again. Because some patterns, it turns out, are simply older and more durable than any single controversy built on top of them. For viewers who want the bare mechanics laid out one final time, stripped of narrative and argument, here is the plain sequence this documentary is traced. 1863, the Prince of Wales feather brooch is made for Queen Alexandra. 1888, Queen Alexandra receives her silver wedding anniversary Kokoshnik Tiara. 1893, the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara arrives as a wedding gift, and the Rothschild diamond watch brooch arrives as a separate wedding present from Alice de Rothschild. 1913, the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara is commissioned. 1919, the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik is made by Boucheron. 1929, the Queen Mother receives the emerald-cut diamond ring later given to Camilla. 1932, Gerard completes Queen Mary's Art Deco bandeau tiara. 1942, Margaret Greville dies and bequeaths her jewelry collection to the Queen Mother. 1947, the Nizam of Hyderabad gifts Princess Elizabeth her wedding necklace, and Queen Mary gifts the girls of Great Britain tiara onward to her granddaughter. 1953, Elizabeth II is crowned and receives the Brazilian aquamarines as a coronation gift, while Queen Mary dies and her jewelry collection disperses according to her will. 1963, Elizabeth II purchases the Belgian sapphire necklace and has it reworked into a tiara. 1973, Camilla wears the Cubit Shan tiara at her first wedding. 1981, Diana marries Charles, wearing the Spencer tiara, and separately receives the Prince of Wales feather brooch as a loan and her own sapphire engagement ring. 1993, the so-called Camillagate recordings become public. 1995, both the Parker Bowles and Wales marriages formally end in divorce. 1996, Diana receives her aquamarine ring as a personal gift following her divorce. 1997, Diana dies, and her personal jewelry begins its separate journey toward her two sons. 2002, the Queen Mother dies at 101, and her Greville inheritance, including the long-unseen Emerald Kokoshnik, passes to Elizabeth II. 2005, Charles and Camilla marry, and Camilla receives the Queen Mother's engagement ring. 2007, Camilla wears the Greville diamond parure publicly for the first time during a state visit to Uganda. 2010, William proposes to Kate Middleton with Diana's own sapphire ring. 2011, William and Kate marry. 2018, Princess Eugenie wears the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik for her wedding, ending its 50-year public silence, and Meghan Markle marries Harry wearing Queen Mary's diamond bandeau tiara instead of the same emerald piece. 2022, Elizabeth II issues her personal statement wishing Camilla to be known as Queen Consort, and dies later that year, triggering the final major transfer of institutional jewelry discussed throughout this film. 2023, Charles is crowned, Camilla wears the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, and a reworked Queen Mary's crown stripped of the Koh-i-Noor. 2024 and 2025, Camilla continues working through the collection at successive state banquets, and in June 2025, she wears the Rothschild diamond watch brooch, unseen in public for 89 years, to Royal Ascot. Laid end-to-end like this, without commentary, the pattern speaks for itself. Every major transfer happens at a death or at a coronation, and never at any point in between simply because one woman was judged more or less deserving than another. That, in the end, is the entire argument this documentary has tried to make, told one final time in the plainest possible form,